Hey guys, tonight we're going deep, like fjord deep, into the steamy and sometimes very confusing world of Viking affection. Specifically kissing. Yep, lip-on-lip contact Norse style, spoiler alert, it's not what you think. In a world full of axe fights, pokey mead halls and gods with questionable motives, you'd assume that a little peck on the lips would be the least scandalous thing going. But nope, among the Vikings, kissing was complicated. Like emotionally, culturally and hygienically. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love knowing which time zones we're drifting off in together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the shores of a chilly Norwegian inlet around the year 900 CE. The wind slices sideways across the water, carrying the tang of salt and seaweed. You can hear the low clatter of boat planks being checked for leaks, and the unmistakable hum of a blacksmith's forge in the distance. A village huddles behind wooden palisades. Inside one of the longhouses, a fire crackles low. It's smoky. Your eyes sting a little. The scent of sweat, animal fat and stale ale hangs in the air like a wool blanket nobody's washed in, ever. And yet, this is home. This is also where you'd go if you wanted to find love, or at least get warm next to someone who wouldn't stab you in your sleep. But here's the thing. Affection in this world doesn't usually involve a kiss, not like how we think of it. There's no first kiss under the stars narrative carved into the side of a runestone. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find much talk of kissing at all in the Old Norse record. When it does appear, it usually signals something big, like the beginning of a major betrayal, or the last thing you do before someone loses an ear. See, to the Vikings, kissing wasn't casual. It was symbolic, sometimes disturbingly so. And unlike modern Western cultures, where kissing often sits at the front of the romantic menu, Norse society didn't necessarily rank it as the main course. It wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't the warm, fuzzy default either. Which makes sense when you think about the context. In a culture where survival was the baseline and honour outweighed feelings, there wasn't a ton of room for tender public displays. Imagine it. You're a Viking warrior home from a raid. You've got loot, bragging rights, and some gnarly new scars. Your woman, assuming she hasn't just remarried while you were gone, is waiting at the door. You step inside the longhouse, shake off the cold, and did you lean in for a soft kiss? Probably not. You might exchange a look, a muttered word, maybe a touch to the arm. If she's feeling bold, maybe she cups your face. But lips, that's loaded territory. You probably wouldn't even see much kissing in public. It's not just that it wasn't romanticised. It was often considered too intimate, too private, or just too strange for open display. In fact, there's a word in Old Norse, kissa, which does mean to kiss, but its use is rare and typically loaded with narrative significance. Think Game of Thrones, but the kind of scenes that end with the blood on the floor, not a fade to black. But don't mistake restraint for oppression. The Vikings were passionate people. They just channeled their affections differently. A meaningful glance, a shared horn of mead, a dance during a winter festival, these were the real sparks. And sometimes a kiss might happen, but it wasn't always sweet. In fact, one saga describes a character being tricked with a kiss that transfers a curse. Another involves a woman kissing a warrior as a test. If he flinches, he's not brave enough for her. Romantic? Sort of. Terrifying? Yes. And gender played a huge role. A man kissing a woman could be seen as asserting dominance. A woman initiating a kiss, she'd better be high status or magical or both. Because if you're just a farmer's daughter laying one on a visiting warrior, it might not go over well, unless it's part of a calculated political move. Yes, even kissing was tactical. But here's a fun twist. Despite the general scarcity of kisses in their texts, Vikings did have deeply emotional relationships. They loved their children fiercely, grieved their spouses publicly, and had serious feelings for their siblings, friends, and even rivals. What they lacked in mouth-on-mouth affection, they made up for in loyalty oaths, hand clasps, and the occasional poem that makes modern love songs look like grocery lists. There's one fringe theory that the Norse weren't into kissing because they just didn't find it hygienic. Consider the state of Viking mouths. No toothbrushes, no breath mints, lots of fermented fish. It's possible that, for them, kissing seemed more gross than sexy. That theory's debated, though. Other scholars argue that the idea of kissing as gross is more of a modern bias, and that Norse folks probably just had different social uses for mouth contact, like sealing oaths, or invoking magic. Speaking of magic, some kisses weren't even about love, they were about transformation. In some obscure folk tales, a kiss from a goddess or witch could turn you into an animal, curse your bloodline, or erase your memory. So yeah, you didn't just kiss someone because you liked them. You had to consider the long-term magical consequences. Imagine that on Tinder. And now, as you shift under your blanket and listen to the fan's slow whir, picture yourself by that longhouse fire again. You're watching two people talk in low voices. One reaches out, brushes a thumb over the other's cheek. Their foreheads touch. Maybe there's a kiss, but it's quick, secret, and carries the weight of everything they can't say aloud. That's the Viking mood. Quietly intense, emotionally complex, and far less about lips than you might have expected. So let's clear this up early. Did the Vikings even kiss? Like actually press lips together for affection, attraction, or ritual? The short answer is probably yes, but not like we do, and not often in the way we imagine. The long answer, it's tangled in language, culture, superstition, and a healthy dose of academic shrugging. But come closer, figuratively, not literally, and let's lean into the grey area together. You start by wandering through the vocabulary. The Old Norse word kissa, as we touched on earlier, did indeed mean to kiss, and it appears in a handful of preserved texts. That right there tells you that the concept of a kiss wasn't foreign, it existed. But when you try to figure out what kind of kiss we're talking about, things get slippery. Was it romantic, familial, symbolic? Some scholars argue that the word might have had a broader application, more like to touch with affection, or to honour with the mouth, which opens a whole other rabbit hole, but we'll get there. Now, if you're expecting an ancient Norse Kama Sutra or a Viking version of the Notebook, you're going to be disappointed. Viking-era writings were mostly practical, laws, genealogies, poems that sound like battle cries, and sagas that detail who killed whom, and whose honour was stained forever. Love scenes, rare. Kisses, rarer. But occasionally someone snuck a smooch into the script. Take Egil's Saga, for example, a tale of one of Iceland's most legendary poets and warriors. There's a moment where Egil kisses his daughter Thorgerd on the cheek after she manipulates him out of a hunger strike. It's tender, human, and deeply meaningful, but not romantic. It's a father's love. And even then, it's notable for how unusual it is in the saga world. It stands out precisely because public displays of emotion, especially physical ones, were so rarely expressed in words. Then there's Gisli's Saga, where a kiss signals not passion, but something closer to deception. A woman offers a kiss that turns out to be a prelude to betrayal, a common literary device across cultures, but particularly intense in a world where your word was as binding as your blade. So a kiss might mean something, or everything, or it might mean death. No pressure. And yet there's another clue tucked into the edges of Viking history. Kissing as a greeting. Some scholars point to evidence that, much like in parts of the Mediterranean today, Norsemen might have kissed each other in greeting, on the cheek, sometimes on the mouth, especially if they were family or close comrades. But here's where it gets spicy in a subtle way. A mouth-to-mouth kiss between men wasn't necessarily romantic. It could be a gesture of trust, a bond between warriors, or even part of a formal oath. It's like a bro hug dialed up to 11, with a side of possible eternal consequences. In a few rare poems, the act of kissing even takes on spiritual weight. There's talk of mouths meeting as a metaphor for fate aligning or spirits merging. That sounds like a lot for a kiss, right? But in a culture where everything meant something, where ravens might be messages from Odin and your dreams could predict your death, a kiss was never just a kiss. Still, don't get too excited. For every poetic kiss, there are a dozen sagas where lovers barely touch. Instead of passion, you get posture. People speak of marriage as taking a woman into the household, which sounds more like livestock management than romance. But that's not to say feelings didn't exist, they just lived below the surface, like a lava flow under ice. One of the fringe theories among historians is that the Vikings simply didn't find kissing important. Maybe in their social structure, it wasn't a culturally meaningful way to show affection. We know that human beings don't universally kiss. Many cultures across history never adopted the practice at all. In fact, recent studies suggest that only about half the world's cultures use kissing in romantic contexts. So it's entirely possible that the Vikings were among the other half, where affection came through touch, tone and shared experiences, not saliva exchange. On the flip side, there's the hygiene argument. Let's face it, mouths were probably not the most appealing things back then. Dental care was essentially non-existent. People chewed resin and maybe wiped their teeth on cloth, but toothaches were real. A morning breath probably came with a body count. Imagine leaning in for a kiss when you've both been eating pickled herring and haven't seen a toothbrush since ever. So maybe kissing was less common not because it was taboo, but because it was just ew. But here's where things get academic, honestly, a little hilarious. There's a scholarly debate, yes, a real one, over whether the Norse concept of the kiss was primarily mouth on mouth, or if it could mean something more abstract. Like, maybe it wasn't even about the physical contact. Maybe the word kisser encompassed any sacred or symbolic gesture made with the mouth, like whispering a name to the gods or breathing life into a spell. That's a lot more mystical than your average goodbye kiss. And if we stretch that even further, some researchers argue that what we'd call a kiss might have occurred more in ritual than in romance. Imagine a chieftain sealing a pact by touching lips to a sacred item, or a priestess pressing her mouth to a talisman during a fertility rite. These were cultures where symbols mattered, so much that your family's honour could rest on a single metaphor. So yeah, maybe the Vikings didn't go around kissing just anyone, but when they did, it counted. So now, back in your cosy bed, let yourself picture this world again, not as loveless, but as layered. Maybe two lovers stand beneath the aurora, sharing a look that's more intimate than any kiss. Or a warrior kneels beside his fallen brother, brushing a kiss on his forehead as a sign of respect, not sorrow. In this place, affection isn't about lips. It's about loyalty, protection, power. You might not kiss someone because you desire them, but because you trust them with your life. And honestly, that kind of kiss might matter more than any romantic one. You press further into the sagas now, like flipping through an ancient diary filled with blood, honour, and the occasional awkward encounter. If you're hoping for a kiss scene that finally feels a little familiar, maybe a shy glance across a feast table, a brush of hands, and then, at last, a stolen kiss, you're going to be waiting a long time. Viking stories didn't waste much time on soft moments. But here's the thing, when kissing does happen in the sagas, it lands like thunder. It's never casual, it's a turning point, an omen, or a warning shot dressed up like affection. Take Laxdæla's saga, one of the most romantically tragic stories in all of Old Norse literature. It features a love triangle between Gudrun Osvifursdottir, yes, say that 5 times fast, Kjartan Olafsson and Bolli Thorleikson. Gudrun is beautiful, clever, and probably one of the most complex female characters in all saga literature. There's one scene, rare and chilly, where a kiss is used not to seal love, but to test it. When Kjartan returns from Norway, possibly converted to Christianity, he comes face to face with Gudrun, now married to Bolli, his cousin and former best friend. It's tense. They talk, and there's this moment where you want there to be a kiss, some gesture to break the ice, but there's nothing, just long looks and bitterness. In that silence you realise something. The kiss that never happened is the one you'll remember forever. In the saga world, kisses don't show up unless they matter. In the saga of the people of Vatnsdal, there's a moment where a woman kisses her husband before he goes off to a doomed duel. It's subtle. She kisses him not with passion, but with fate. He doesn't return. The kiss becomes a goodbye she knew was permanent. It's cinematic, really. If sagas were movies, that would be the scene where the music swells to us and everyone in the theatre knows what's coming. But sometimes the kiss itself is dangerous. In Völsunga Saga, which is about as subtle as a thunderclap in a cave, there's a kiss between Sigurd and the shieldmaiden Brynhild that spirals into jealousy, betrayal, and blood-soaked tragedy. When they meet, Sigurd awakens her from a magical sleep. Yes, like a gritty Viking sleeping beauty. And they kiss. But the kiss isn't just a hello or a promise. It's a seal, a magical hinge on which both of their fates swing. Later, when Sigurd forgets her due to a cursed potion and marries someone else, Brynhild doesn't just get sad, she engineers everyone's destruction. So yeah, the kiss here is less sweet first moment and more button that triggers an avalanche. And these aren't outliers. In saga after saga, when a kiss appears, it's less affection and more plot device. A kiss means things are about to unravel, or explode, or haunt you, It's like in those horror movies where a character smiles and says, "Everything's going to be fine." That's when you know you're doomed. In Viking storytelling, a kiss almost always signals a shift. Someone will die, fall in love with the wrong person, or get tricked into a blood feud. Probably all three. The weird part? These kisses aren't described in steamy detail. Don't expect the sagas to talk about soft lips or trembling hands. No! It'll be something like, "And she kissed him, and so began the sorrow of her days." That's it. That's your romance. Dry, cryptic, devastating. You almost respect the restraint. But it makes you wonder, were these kisses actually happening this way? Or were the saga writers, usually male monks or later chroniclers, just editing things for propriety? There's an ongoing scholarly debate here. Some researchers argue that kissing and physical affection probably existed more than the text let on. It just wasn't the kind of thing men writing warrior stories wanted to focus on. After all, these stories were passed down through oral tradition before being written, often shaped by values of strength, stoicism, and social order. Romance was allowed, sure, but only if it came with consequences. There's also the theory that the saga kiss was deliberately symbolic. Since the sagas rarely waste time on frivolity, a kiss couldn't just be a sweet moment. It had to carry weight. Think about that. In a world where words were magic and names held power, physical gestures weren't empty either. A kiss could curse you, it could bind you, or it could be a false promise that echoes across generations. On the flip side, some fringe thinkers have gone full conspiracy theory with this. There's a little corner of academia that believes kisses in the sagas are coded language, like metaphors for sex or spiritual union. It's speculative but not entirely ridiculous. The sagas love metaphor. They describe women as swans, ships, or battlefields. They describe swords as snakes. So maybe a kiss wasn't always about lips. Maybe it was about power, or allegiance, or even submission. But here's the catch, you'll never know for sure. The sagas don't come with footnotes explaining how many teeth were involved in any given kiss. You're left to interpret it yourself. Was it gentle? Was it fierce? Was it even consensual? That last one's important, because consent in Viking stories is often murky. Women had more agency than you might think, but relationships were still transactional, arranged, or entangled in family politics. So if someone kisses someone else in a saga, the gesture might be loaded with cultural implications we can't fully unpack. Still, you imagine it. You picture two characters sitting close beside the hearth, their shadows flickering on the wall. Maybe he reaches for her hand. Maybe she turns, her braid brushing his arm. Their eyes meet. There's tension sharp as a whetted blade. And then, a kiss. Not a Hollywood kiss, but a Viking kiss. Quiet, dangerous, heavy with meaning. And in that moment, everything changes. So now that you're properly suspicious of every kiss in a Viking saga, let's ask a more down-to-earth question. What did real-life Viking courtship actually look like? If kisses were rare and potentially ominous, how did two people even get to the point of marriage, or at least a shared bed of straw and furs, without the tools we think of today as romantic prerequisites? Turns out the Norse had their own way of flirting, wooing, and emotionally fencing that didn't require locking lips. If you were looking for love in the Viking Age, you had to think a little more transactionally. You wake up in your 9th century Scandinavian village. The morning is cold, obviously, and a thin mist is hovering over the thatched rooftops like a mood filter. You're of marrying age, which doesn't necessarily mean you're emotionally ready. It just means your parents are starting to make quiet deals with other families, usually over things like land, honour, or the number of milking goats someone owns. Romance isn't out of the picture, but it definitely shares the stage with property law. If you're a young man, you might spot someone across the field or at a seasonal feast and think, yeah, she's the one, but you don't just walk up and ask for her number. That's not how this works. You'd go to your family and ask them to speak with hers. Proposals are formal and they involve a lot of back and forth, almost like negotiating a merger. Both families want to protect their reputations and ensure the union brings mutual advantage. If feelings are involved, cool, but they're a bonus, not a requirement. Now, if the marriage is agreed upon, that's when the real social dance begins. During the betrothal period, you're allowed to interact a bit more. You might talk, sit beside each other, exchange gifts, maybe even sneak away during a festival to whisper under the trees, but again, not much kissing, not because people weren't attracted to each other, but because touching was serious. Physical affection, particularly anything that hinted at sexuality, was a signal of intent, not flirtation. There were some subtler ways to express interest, though. Hair played a big role. Vikings took immense pride in their locks. A man might braid his beard in a particular way, or a woman might wear her hair uncovered to signal availability. Clothing mattered too. A girl who wore her keyring, symbolising control of the household, was signalling that she was either married or had accepted someone's suit. If she wore it, and you still tried to court her, bold, and likely to end with you in a shallow grave. One of the more poetic customs was gift-giving. If a man liked a woman, he might carve her a piece of jewellery, a figurine, or even a rune-inscribed token. Runes were a big deal. Carving someone's name or initials into a gift wasn't just sweet, it was magical, literally. Writing was tied to spells and fate, so handing someone a love rune was the Viking version of a mixtape, except possibly cursed. And women gave gifts too, textiles mostly. Imagine weaving someone a custom tunic and stitching your affections into every thread. That's labour-intensive love. If the man wore it proudly, he was basically announcing to the world, "Yep, I'm hers," a Viking version of changing your relationship status, only warmer. But let's be real, some courtships didn't go smoothly. Just like today, there were creepy guys, pushy relatives, and feelings that weren't always mutual. If a woman didn't want to marry a suitor, she could say no, but it wasn't always easy. Families might pressure her, and honour was often at stake. That's when things got murky, and occasionally violent. There are sagas full of rejected suitors who responded badly, either challenging the new husband to a duel, or trying to kidnap the bride. Viking romance was not always romantic, still it wasn't all doom. There are stories, both legendary and historical, of real love matches. People who genuinely liked each other, who laughed and grew old together. Archaeological digs have uncovered graves with couples buried side by side, their hands still joined across 1,000 years. That kind of quiet devotion doesn't get as much press as the blood feuds, but it was there. You can feel it in the artifacts, in the care someone took to place a comb beside their partner's body, or to tuck in a shared amulet for the afterlife. And here's a charming little fringe fact. Some rune stones appear to carry love messages. One found in Sweden reads like a declaration. Name, made this in memory of his beloved. It's not clear if a kiss ever passed between them, but the sentiment lingers etched in stone. That's longer lasting than lipstick on a collar. Now let's talk about flirting Viking style. Eye contact was everything. A lingering gaze across the fire could speak volumes. Physical closeness was also a clue. If two people stood or sat together, particularly at public events like seasonal gatherings, it was noticed. Gossip moved fast, even without smartphones. A man reaching to refill a woman's mead cup could be interpreted as romantic. It might not seem like much now, but in a world where modesty and control were highly prized, that small gesture could shout. And humour played a role too. Believe it or not, Vikings loved jokes. Some sagas include scenes where clever wordplay becomes a form of flirtation. A well-timed quip, a slightly suggestive pun. Those were weapons in the arsenal of affection. So if you were clever with words, you had a shot. But the biggest marker of affection, aside from marriage, was trust. Letting someone into your emotional world, sharing a dream, revealing a fear, even asking for a favour, those were serious gestures. More than a kiss, trust was the foundation. That, and not stabbing each other during mealtime arguments. So now, with your head sinking into the pillow and your imagination drifting to those torchlit feasts and starlit walks, you picture it again. Not a grand cinematic kiss, not yet, just two people sitting a little too close sharing a carved wooden cup, their knees brush. They exchange a look. Maybe she smiles, maybe he stammers, and in that quiet space between what's said and what's allowed, something starts to glow. Let's pivot now, gently, slowly, to something that shaped almost everything about Viking life, including intimacy, gender. Forget what you learned in Saturday morning cartoons about big bearded men yelling, "Valhalla!" and their wives waiting dutifully at home with soup. Viking gender roles were surprisingly complex, layered, and, depending on your social class or how many swords you owned, surprisingly flexible. And when it came to love, power, and yes, those rare loaded kisses, these roles played a massive part in determining who could initiate what, and when. Now imagine yourself in the boots or bare feet of a Viking woman. You're standing in the doorway of your longhouse, squinting at the horizon where the sea meets the mountains. Maybe you're married. Maybe you're the daughter of a powerful jarl or a thrall with dreams of something better. Whoever you are, you're not helpless. Not by a long shot. Viking women had more legal agency than many of their medieval European counterparts. They could own land, manage property, divorce their husbands, and even demand compensation if a marriage turned sour. But that doesn't mean they were running around kissing whoever they liked. Affection was still bound by status, ritual, and honour. Enter the shieldmaiden. She's probably one of the most misunderstood figures in Norse mythology and history. Think Lagertha from Vikings, braided, fierce, sword-slinging and smouldering with controlled rage. While actual historical evidence for widespread female warriors is debated, the sagas are filled with their stories. And when shieldmaidens did fall in love, it was never passive. These women weren't waiting for permission. If they kissed a man, it wasn't demure, it was a challenge. There's a story in Hervarar saga Oke Hydrex about Hervor, the daughter of a berserker, who disguises herself as a man, becomes a warrior, and travels to a cursed island to speak with her dead father. She's clever, fierce, and not interested in romance, but when she eventually does settle down, the relationship is built not on sweetness or tradition, but mutual respect. In a culture where love was a risk, strength was seductive. So when a woman kissed a man, if she did at all, it was a power move, and not always a welcome one. There's a line in Njal saga about a woman being so bold that her kiss shamed the man more than a wound in battle. That's a heavy insult in Viking terms. Basically, if a woman took the lead, the man better be worthy, or he'd be mocked for not measuring up. This wasn't just about gender dynamics, it was about public image. Reputation in Norse society was everything. One poorly timed kiss, and your name could be dragged through the mead hall for decades. But don't assume Viking women were cold or oppressed. Far from it. They expressed affection differently, sometimes with silence, sometimes with stinging wit, sometimes with acts of incredible loyalty. In Gunnlaug's saga Ormstungu, a love triangle unfolds between a poet, Gunnlaug, and the noblewoman Helga the Fair. She's beautiful and clever, and despite being married to another man, her heart still burns for Gunnlaug. There's a devastating moment when she stares longingly at the cloak he once gave her. No kiss, no embrace, just a look. And yet it hits harder than any physical touch could. Here's the twist. Viking men weren't as emotionally shut down as the stereotypes suggest. Yes, they fought. Yes, they shouted. But they also wrote poetry. Love poetry. The skalds, elite poet warriors, could pen verses that made hearts ache and ears burn. Imagine a man carving a stanza into a piece of driftwood and sending it down the river to reach his beloved, or whispering a poem into her ear before riding off to war. These weren't all macho war machines. They were complicated, sentimental, even vulnerable, though probably only in front of people they trusted not to laugh. There's also a fringe theory floating around that suggests Vikings may have admired assertiveness in women more than we might assume. In some sagas, a bold woman is seen not as a threat, but as a match. That changes the dynamic. A woman's kiss isn't a submission, it's a proposition, a test. Can you handle me, it says, and if the man flinches, fumbles, or fails to match her fire, well, enjoy sleeping alone next to your underwhelming sheep count. But even with all this nuance, Viking society was still deeply patriarchal. Men controlled the most visible aspects of power, warfare, land, legal authority, which meant that expressions of affection from women, especially physical ones, had to be deliberate and calculated. A kiss wasn't just romantic, it could be scandalous, risky, even strategic. Think of Queen Gunhild, a legendary and somewhat controversial figure in the sagas. She's portrayed as cunning, ruthless, and sexually bold. In one story, she seduces a young man and then arranges for him to be executed. The kiss in that story, not exactly tender, is the kind of thing that makes you check your drink and back slowly away from the mead bench. But again, the power dynamic is the point. When a high-status woman kisses someone, it's never innocent. It's an act of control, desire, and sometimes destruction. So what does all this tell us? That in the Viking world, kissing wasn't just about lips. It was about hierarchy. Who kissed first mattered, where you were mattered, and who saw it. That could make or break your social standing. A kiss in private could signal passion or alliance, A kiss in public? That was a declaration or a provocation. And now, as you lie there under your blankets, the hum of your fan just loud enough to feel like a longhouse hearth, you can picture it. A crowded hall, a feast in full swing. Everyone's drunk on mead and ego. A woman, tall, unbothered, dangerous, walks straight up to a young warrior and presses a kiss to his mouth. Not soft, not sweet, just enough to make every other conversation stop mid-sentence. He doesn't move, he doesn't breathe, he just stands there, suddenly aware that nothing in his life will ever be small again. That's not a kiss for love, that's a kiss for legacy. So now that we've peeked behind the smoke curtains of Viking gender roles, let's step even closer to the heart of where all the social games and emotional mysteries unfolded, the longhouse. Picture it like a cross between a family home, a town hall, and a low-key bar fight waiting to happen. This was the central unit of Viking life, where you slept, ate, plotted, bickered, made alliances, buried grudges, and if you were feeling especially risky, showed a bit of affection. But affection in this space? Oh, it had rules. Rules etched not into stone, but into glances, gestures, and expectations older than any saga. You push open the creaking door and step inside. It's dim, warm, but not cosy. The air is thick with the scent of smoked meat, damp wool, and humans who've been sitting too close together for too long. Smoke curls from the central fire pit, rising into the rafters where it clings like old secrets. All around you, people sit on raised benches, eating, drinking, arguing, laughing. There's no privacy, not really. You might have a curtain of woven fabric separating your sleeping area, but sound travels. Eyes travel faster. So what did this mean for affection? Well, public displays of it were discouraged. Not banned exactly, no one was handing out fines for a lingering touch, but it just wasn't the vibe. The Viking world valued self-control, composure, dignity. Losing your temper or bursting into tears in public, not ideal. Kissing someone in front of others, that was a statement. Either a challenge or a claim, and both could get you into trouble. Now mead hall culture was festive for sure. Feasts were held for weddings, births, victories, funerals, any excuse to roast something and pour drinks until the floor got blurry. But even during these blowouts, affection had its limits. If you were sitting beside your intended, passing cups and whispering sweet nothings, you were already pushing the envelope. A casual arm around the shoulder? Risky. A kiss? Practically a declaration of war? And yet Vikings weren't robots. Feelings didn't disappear just because manners frowned on them. So people found workarounds, a brush of hands while passing a platter, leaning just a bit too close to someone during a song. Some of the sagas even reference feet touching under tables. That's right, Viking footsie. Because sometimes intimacy had to hide in plain sight. There's a fringe but fascinating theory that in these tight communal spaces, people developed a language of subtle signals. A certain way of placing your drinking horn down might mean, I want to speak with you later. An intentional pause before toasting someone's name could be flirtation or threat. You really had to be paying attention. And maybe that was the point. In a culture where honour meant everything, showing restraint wasn't just polite, it was powerful. But things could get looser after enough mead. Alcohol flowed freely at these gatherings, and just like in any society, it loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions. Drunken declarations of love happened. So did fights, sometimes both at once. If a couple kissed after 3 horns of mead, it might be laughed off the next day, or remembered forever. That's the risk, once seen, never unseen, and reputations were long-lasting currency in Viking society. One slip up and your name travelled farther than your ship ever would. Still, there are stories, quiet ones, of moments behind the curtain. 2 people sneaking away during a feast, the woven divider pulled gently shut. There's no need to imagine fireworks. These were the kinds of kisses you whisper about. Soft, tentative, perhaps hurried, muffled by the sounds of laughter and drums outside. Not every romance was about drama. Some were just about warmth, about finding a heartbeat in the chaos. And of course, there were affairs. This wasn't a society immune to temptation. People cheated. People lied. There are sagas about married women sending secret messages to younger men, offering favours in exchange for silence. And if a kiss was shared under those circumstances, that wasn't romance, it was danger. If caught, Both parties could face social ruin or worse. But again, that risk made it all the more charged. A single kiss stolen in a hidden corner could hold more tension than a battlefield. It wasn't just lovers navigating this terrain. Family affection was also a delicate dance. Parents might kiss their children, but rarely in public. Grief, though, sometimes overrode those rules. In sagas where a parent loses a child, they often kiss the body during the funeral rites. These moments are raw, unguarded, and they're rare enough that when they appear, they hit like a punch to the chest. There's even a moment in Eavesdrop Saga where a man kisses the corpse of his son before burial. Not romantic, obviously, but intimate in the most human way. A reminder that Vikings weren't stoic because they lacked feeling. They were stoic because showing feeling made you vulnerable. And vulnerability could be a weakness or a weapon. So yes, the longhouse was a space of rules and eyes and social pressure, but it was also the backdrop for thousands of tiny moments of affection. A couple whispering in the dark, a child curling up beside their mother, a widow tracing the handle of her late husband's axe with her fingertips. These weren't grand gestures. They were quieter, but maybe more powerful for it. Now, as you burrow into your blanket and let your body relax, you can imagine yourself there, in the firelit hush of midnight, the embers glowing like sleepy eyes. Someone beside you stirs. A hand touches yours. Barely. No one else sees. No one else needs to. In this world, love isn't loud, it's quiet, subtle, and all the more real because of it. That's what made a kiss, if and when it happened, such a charged, trembling thing. Not just the press of lips, but everything unsaid that hung between them. Now that we've tiptoed through the longhouse, where every sideways glance felt like a risk, let's change the vibe completely. Let's walk straight into the wild, unfiltered chaos of a Viking feast. Because if there was ever a time when someone might throw caution, and maybe even dignity to the wind and go for a kiss, it was deep into a mead hall night, when the fire was blazing, the storytellers were shouting over the lyre players, and everyone's social filters had been thoroughly drowned in ale. Imagine it, long benches packed shoulder to shoulder, roasted meats crackling over the fire, people toasting so often that you're no longer sure what you're drinking to. Victory, fertility, the goat that got unstuck from the bog, doesn't matter. What matters is that you're surrounded by warmth, laughter and people who, 5 hours ago, might have been too honourable to touch your sleeve, but now seem a little more available. Feasts were central to Viking culture. They weren't just about food, they were about flexing status, celebrating alliances, honouring gods, and maybe flirting just enough that something more came out of it. But even here, affection had its code. Toasting someone's name in public was a big deal. It was kind of like saying, "Hey, I see you," only with more social pressure. If someone toasted you, especially during the early rounds, that meant you mattered. You weren't just background noise. You were in focus, and depending on who you were and who they were, that toast could carry layers of meaning. So how does this relate to kissing? Well, a feast was probably one of the only social environments where something like a kiss might happen without being premeditated. Not exactly casual, but circumstantial. If you'd been flirting across the table all night, passing horns of mead, leaning in a little too close when the music swelled, the moment might build until one of you finally broke protocol and let the spark land. Maybe with a kiss on the cheek, maybe a bold brush of lips before anyone could interrupt. And in that drunken, firelit blur, you might even get away with it. But make no mistake, the moment the kiss happened, you'd just changed your fate. Everyone who saw it now had an opinion. Was it appropriate? Were you promised to someone else? Was the timing right? Was it before the closing oath of the feast, or after the sacred toast to the gods? Yes, that mattered. Everything in Viking society was structured. Even the disorder had rules. Now, if you're imagining a mead hall full of people kissing each other like it's a Norse prom, hold your reindeer. Viking parties weren't a free-for-all. In fact, public affection was still largely limited. But they were where inhibitions lowered and boundaries blurred just enough for new dynamics to form. A drunken compliment might become a whispered proposal. A shared song might linger just long enough to make hearts beat a little faster. And every so often there'd be a moment, a kiss, a touch, a look that passed between two people. Like a spark on dry kindling. There's a particularly juicy story from Greta's saga, where a woman named Steinver gets a bit cosy with Greta during a visit to her home. Now, nothing overtly romantic happens, on the surface. but the descriptions, full of subtle tension, the kind that makes you suspect something passed between them, that the text's too polite to spell out. Scholars argue over whether Grettir and Steinver shared a kiss, or more, or nothing at all, but the moment feels charged, and it's set during a gathering, which tells you something. Feasts were where boundaries were tested, not always crossed, but tested. There's also a fringe debate among historians about whether the Vikings might have had ritualised forms of affection during feasts, gestures that were acceptable only in that context. For example, some theories suggest that during certain fertility festivals or seasonal celebrations like Yule or Freya's Day, kisses might have been more common, even encouraged, not just for fun but as symbolic acts. A kiss during these rituals wasn't just physical, it was calling in good fortune, fertility, or divine favour. That changes everything, doesn't it? Now, a kiss isn't just affection, it's an offering. And speaking of ritual, some of these festivals involve disguises, roleplay, and temporary inversion of norms. Picture a hall where people wear masks, switch roles, sing bawdy songs, and act out myths. In this atmosphere, a kiss becomes both less personal and more dangerous. You don't know who's under the mask. You don't know who's watching. You only know that the air is thick with smoke, music, and the sense that for just one night, you might be able to rewrite your story. Of course, it wasn't always playful. Alcohol and bravado made for a risky combination. Unwanted advances happened. Fights broke out. Sometimes a kiss was given not out of affection, but challenge, one warrior daring another, or mocking them. There are reports in later medieval texts of men kissing rivals mockingly, as a prelude to insult. Whether the Vikings shared this tradition is debated, but the psychology fits. In a world where your name mattered more than your net worth, humiliation could be a weapon. And still, despite the risk, the danger, and the public scrutiny, those little mead-drenched kisses did happen. Not often, not lightly, but enough to leave echoes, enough to show up in stories passed down for centuries. And maybe that's the point. A kiss wasn't something you gave freely. It was a crack in the armour. A glimpse of something tender in a world obsessed with strength. A flash of heat in a cold hall full of sharp eyes. So as you lie here, tucked in your modern bed, safe from sagas and social fallout, imagine the flicker of torchlight across a stranger's face. Imagine the sound of laughter, boots scuffing the wooden floor, the low thump of drums, and your heart pounding just a little too fast. Then imagine leaning in, just slightly, and the warm press of a mouth against yours, sweetened by mead and smoke and midnight daring. Brief, bold, possibly foolish, but unforgettable. Now that you've tasted the sweet fermented chaos of the feast night flirtation, it's time to tiptoe into stranger waters, because in the Norse world, kisses didn't just belong to mortals. The gods kissed too, and just like everything the gods touched, those kisses came loaded with consequences, curses, transformations, forgotten identities, whole family lines spiralling into ruin. Some kisses even blurred the boundary between magic and malice. If you thought a drunk mead hall kiss was risky, try being kissed by a shape-shifting sea witch on a windswept cliff. That's when things get weird, and honestly, way more interesting. Let's start with the goddess you think you know, Freyja, the Norse deity of love, beauty, fertility and magic. She's often compared to Aphrodite or Venus, but really, Freya's in her own category. She's radiant, yes, but also battle-hardened, cunning, and just as likely to curse you as bless you. She rides a chariot pulled by cats, which already makes her more interesting than any love goddess on record. And when Freyja kisses someone in the myths, it's never soft. It's a deal, a spell, a promise that will unfold like a rune and carve itself into fate. One of the most unsettling stories tied to Freya involves her cloak of falcon feathers, which allows her, or anyone she lends it to fly. In one tale, the trickster god Loki borrows this cloak and uses it to help the gods out of a jam, but in another, less polished variant whispered along the folklore fringes, someone tries to steal the cloak by seducing Freya. The story's vague about whether the kiss that follows is sincere, magical, or a manipulation, but the outcome is the same. Freya knows, always, and she curses the thief with a kiss that causes his voice to vanish every time he lies. Oof. But not all divine kisses were punishment. Some were portals. In several obscure Eddic fragments and folk traditions, kisses are described as awakening forces, transforming humans into animals, or opening the memory of past lives. These stories don't come from the famous prose Edda or poetic Edda, but from the cultural compost that surrounded them. Oral tales, regional myths, scraps of verse recorded centuries later. And in these tales, a kiss might bind you to a spirit, or awaken your second sight, or turn you into a raven until the next full moon. Honestly, it's kind of romantic in a very you might not survive this way. And then there's the whole category of kisses between gods and mortals. These always walk the razor's edge between honour and doom. There's a late Icelandic folktale about a mortal woman who meets a mysterious traveller during a solstice ritual. He kisses her, disappears, and 9 months later she gives birth to a child who can speak in full sentences and summon fire. Is it a love story? A divine assault? A blessing? No one agrees. That's the thing with Norse mythology. It loves its grey areas. One of the more obscure but fascinating bits of Norse lore comes from a fragment in the Saga of the Wise Fool, where a man claims to have been kissed by the goddess Skadi, not out of affection, but as a form of trial. Skadi, the winter goddess who once married into the Aesir after demanding compensation for her father's death, isn't exactly known for her warmth. The kiss reportedly turns the man's beard to frost and his voice to gravel. Again, not your average rom-com moment. And Loki? You just know Loki couldn't let kissing stay innocent. In several stories, he shapeshifts to seduce or trick others, sometimes even in female form. There's one myth where Loki, as a woman, kisses a Jarl in order to plant a false memory in his mind. The man wakes days later convinced he once loved her. Some scholars think this was a poetic device, a metaphor for confusion or deception. Others suggest it reflects deeper anxieties about identity, control, and the vulnerability of desire. Either way, the kiss was a weapon. Speaking of magical manipulation, there are runic references to kiss-related spells. One such spell, loosely translated as Munkos Hamingja, or Mouth Kiss of Fortune, is said to be carved into amulets or sung over charms. The idea was that a kiss, sealed with the right incantation, could bring good luck, or bind someone's fate to yours. Romantic? Sure. Controlling? Absolutely. That's Norse love magic for you, equal parts enchantment and entrapment. But not all these stories are dark. Some dream kisses in Norse myth are gently mysterious. In several fragments from later saga poetry, people receive visions through kisses in dreams. A woman might dream of being kissed by a god, and wake with a prophecy burning on her lips. A warrior might dream of kissing a Valkyrie before battle, and survive against all odds. Were these literal dreams, or poetic shorthand for divine messages? Scholars don't agree, but the symbolism is rich. The kiss becomes a bridge between realms, between fates, and in at least one unusual tale, a kiss undoes a curse. In a version of the Hrolf Kraki cycle, a beastly man, cursed with a bear's rage and isolation, is kissed by a girl brave enough to look him in the eyes. It's not a Beauty and the Beast moment exactly. It's more raw, less stylized. But the curse breaks, not because of her innocence, but because she understands his sorrow. That kind of emotional intelligence, rare in any era, especially the Viking one. There's an open debate in Norse studies about whether these magical kiss motifs were native to Scandinavia, or borrowed from continental Europe as Christian influence crept in. Kisses as spells? That smells like French courtly romance to some scholars. But others argue that the concept predates the church, rooted instead in shamanic traditions, where the mouth was seen as a sacred portal. Words, after all, were power. Breath was life. A kiss combined both. So here you are now, lying in the dark, tracing back the thread of those mythic kisses. Not sweet, not innocent, not even said, but powerful. And maybe that's what makes them so unforgettable. A mortal kisses a goddess, and the stars rearrange. A cursed warrior kisses a dream and wakes a changed man. In this world, a kiss isn't the start of a love story. It's the hinge on which the whole story turns. By now, you've seen kisses in the Viking world as rare, high-stakes moments, poetic, dangerous, even mystical. But let's turn now to something that looks, at first glance, almost the opposite of romance. Male friendship. Not the distant, grunt-filled sort of bro-bonding you might expect from a culture steeped in axes and blood feuds. No, real, intimate, often poetic male friendships that pushed up against the boundaries of what we, centuries later, might label platonic. So let's talk about brotherhood, and beards, and the occasional brush of lips between battle-hardened men. Start by setting the scene, a windswept cliff overlooking a fjord. Two men cloaked in fur stand side by side in silence. They've fought together, bled for each other, maybe even buried comrades side by side, but there's no one else around, just the cry of gulls and the distant churn of waves below. And then one of them turns to the other and says something like, "Your name will live on in my saga." That's Viking bromance. It's deep, solemn, and about as emotionally intense as it gets without setting anything on fire. But did these bonds ever include a kiss? Well, depending on how you define it, possibly yes. There are references in sagas to men kissing each other, especially in greetings or farewells. These weren't sloppy, open-mouthed affairs, obviously. They were often cheek kisses or brief mouth-to-mouth gestures that carried weight. Symbolic, not sexual. But they weren't casual either. You didn't go around kissing every battle buddy. These were reserved for your closest companions, your foster brother, your oath-bound comrade, or the man who had just saved your life in a raid gone sideways. Take the example of foster brothers. In Viking society, fostering was a big deal. You might send your child to live with another family to strengthen political ties, or to learn a trade, or to gain a different perspective. And the bonds formed in fostering could be deeper than blood. Foster brothers often became lifelong allies, bound not just by shared childhoods, but by oaths. They pledged loyalty, shared fortunes, and defended each other's honour, and sometimes they kissed. Now this part is where the scholars start arguing. Some see these kisses as strictly symbolic, like a knight's kiss of loyalty in later European tradition. Others read between the lines and see emotional or even romantic undertones. There's a passage in Gisli's saga where Gisli shares a final tender moment with his foster brother, before heading off to certain death. No kiss is described directly, but the language is emotional, even loving. "I would not have lived without you," one says. "I will not live without you now." Do we interpret that as affection between brothers in arms? Or is there something more? That's the open question. Viking culture didn't have the same boxes we do today. There were no clear-cut categories for just friends, secret lovers, or somewhere in between. Emotional intimacy between men was not automatically viewed through a sexual lens. In fact, deep affection between male warriors was often praised. What mattered more than how you expressed it was how it fit within the codes of honour and masculinity. Now, about the beards. In a culture where masculinity was symbolised by strength, scars and beard length, facial hair was a serious business. Vikings groomed their beards carefully, sometimes braiding them, sometimes oiling them with animal fat. There's at least one poem where a man talks about brushing his beard against his friend's cheek in a farewell gesture. Is it a kiss? Not quite, but it's intimate. And in a society where physical closeness between men wasn't automatically suspect, it speaks volumes. And then there's the very odd fringe case of the beard rub greeting, a ritualised form of affection found in a few patchy sources. Some believe this involved men placing their cheeks or beards together as a kind of bond-sealing gesture. Not quite a kiss, but definitely within arm's reach of one. Others say this might be a mistranslation, or a medieval chronicler projecting later European customs backward onto Viking life. Either way, it's one of those delightfully ambiguous bits of history that makes you wonder how many layers of emotion could hide in the way two warriors said goodbye. Of course, same-sex attraction existed. That's not up for debate. What is debated is how the Norse treated it. Old Norse law was famously harsh toward men accused of being on the receiving end of sex acts. They used the term ergi, meaning unmanly, as a deeply offensive accusation. But again, kissing didn't necessarily cross that line. It could still exist in the murky territory between loyalty, mourning and affection, without tipping into taboo. You'll find stories, quiet, whispered ones, of men who chose never to marry, but lived with another man for years, sharing land, labour, and legacy. Were they just lifelong friends? Were they partners in a way that went unspoken? The sagas don't always say. But it's not hard to imagine a moment between them, a fire dying low, snow falling quietly outside, and one man leaning in to press a brief kiss to the other's forehead. Not as lovers, necessarily. Not as brothers, either. There's something else. Something Viking society didn't have a word for, but honoured all the same. There's even a line in Egil's saga, a classic Viking epic full of blood and poetry, where Egil composes a verse about his fallen friend and says, "No treasure I seek, but the warmth of your shoulder. It's grief, yes, but it's also longing. Deep, aching longing. And if a kiss ever happened in that moment, across the body of a friend during a funeral rite, or in secret before a battle, well, who's to say it didn't? So as you settle deeper into the dark, your own shoulders tucked beneath the weight of sleep, imagine this. 2 men on a cold plain, camped beneath a canopy of stars. They fought together, sung together, buried their dead together, and one of them, knowing the dawn will bring blood and fire, leans close, just for a moment, just enough, a whisper, a breath, the warmth of skin against skin. Maybe it's a kiss, maybe it's a promise. Either way, it's something worth remembering. Tonight we step into one of the darker, stranger corners of Viking life, the intersection of affection and death. Now, don't pull the covers up just yet. Yes, it's grim, but it's also oddly intimate, because in this world the line between love and loss was razor thin, and death didn't always mean goodbye. In fact, some of the most charged, most haunting kisses in Norse legend happen when one of the people involved is already on the other side. And in a culture obsessed with honour, legacy and burial rites, those final gestures, kisses included, meant everything. Let's start with what you might call the farewell kiss. In modern funerals, that gesture tends to be symbolic. A touch to the coffin, a whispered goodbye, maybe a kiss to a cold forehead in a moment of grief. But in Viking tradition, death rituals were even more theatrical, and sometimes more physical. A body wasn't just buried, it was dressed, positioned, armed, sometimes burned, sometimes set adrift in a boat-turned funeral pyre. The body was prepared for its journey to the afterlife. And in rare but powerful stories, that preparation included a kiss. Imagine it. A young warrior lies still on the funeral table. His mother kneels beside him, tears held back by pride, and leans in to press her lips to his brow. Not because she expects warmth, but because that kiss is her last act of defiance against death. You are still mine, it says, even in Valhalla. It's not common, but it happens. A handful of saga moments mention this sort of touch. They don't always say kiss, the language is vague, like laid her mouth to him, or placed lips on the fallen. But the intent is clear. This wasn't about romance. It was about connection, about saying you were loved, even if you never made it home from the raid. And then there's the even more unsettling side of this, kisses between the living and the not quite dead. Norse mythology is crawling with revenants, undead beings, ghosts, restless corpses. Not zombies exactly, but walking dead with unfinished business. They climb out of their mounds, they speak in riddles, they demand things. And sometimes they kiss, not because they're affectionate, but because the kiss does something. Transfers a curse, seals a pact, binds a soul. Take the ghost of Thorolfur Birgifotter in Erbyggia Saga. After death, he becomes a draugr, a restless corpse who refuses to stay buried. His body continues to sit upright, his eyes open, his presence filling the house with dread. There's no kiss in this story, but the closeness is unbearable. It makes you wonder, if someone had kissed him goodbye, performed some last act of love or recognition, would he have stayed buried? Or would that have made things worse? Then there's a lesser-known folktale from northern Norway, more oral tradition than formal saga, where a grieving woman kisses the lips of her drowned husband before placing coins on his eyes. That kiss, the story goes, causes his soul to linger. He returns to her that night, dripping wet, crawling into bed beside her. She never speaks again. Was it grief that called him back, or was it the kiss that gave him permission? And don't even get started on the Christian overlay. As the Norse world began to shift toward Christianity, burial customs changed. Kisses became part of religious farewells, kissing relics, kissing crosses, kissing saints' bones. These were new practices layered over old beliefs, but they weren't always adopted cleanly. Some Viking converts saw the kiss not as reverent, but as risky. Why kiss a relic when you didn't know what kind of spirit might be watching? Still, the kiss's blessing began to appear in burials. Some missionaries and priests offered the kiss of peace to the dying, a symbolic act meant to guide the soul gently into the next world. It was a softer, more merciful version of what the old gods offered, which, let's be honest, was usually a violent battlefield and a side of mead. But what about the living kissing the dead, not out of grief, but ritual? There are strange accounts, mostly whispers from folkloric margins, of women performing love rituals involving graves. Not necromancy exactly, but ancestor magic. A kiss given to a carved skull, or to the lips of a statue representing a dead lover. The idea being that the act would summon the spirit, call it to walk with the living again. These stories aren't common, and historians argue about their authenticity, but they persist. And where there's fire, there's at least a spark of truth. Let's go even over weirder. There are scattered references, more literary than historical, to the idea of the kiss of death. Not in the mafia sense, but more literal. A kiss that ends a life. In some magical traditions of the Norse-influenced British Isles, a woman known as a kissing witch could kill a man with a single kiss. Whether that's metaphor for heartbreak or actual poison is anyone's guess, but the myth endured. There's even a freaky fringe theory that the goddess Hel, yes, the ruler of the underworld, could claim a soul with a kiss. She wasn't beautiful, at least not in the traditional sense. Half of her body was corpse pale, the other half livid and decaying, but her kiss said to be cold enough to stop the heart. That's not love, that's inevitability. Still, the idea that love lingers past death, especially in something as intimate as a kiss, is deeply Norse in spirit. The Vikings didn't see life and death as opposites, they saw them as parts of a cycle. What dies may rise, what's buried may return, and what's kissed in farewell might find its way back to you, in dreams or echoes or the way your children smile. So as you lie there, your room dark and still, imagine this final image. A stone ship-shaped grave, filled with the scent of pine and seawater. A warrior lies still, sword at his side. His partner, woman or man, leans in for a last kiss. Not for comfort, not for drama, but for memory. For something to carry through the rest of a long, quiet life. Because sometimes the deepest kiss isn't the one you live for, it's the one you never forget. Let's shake the frost off and set sail, literally. Because tonight, we're talking about how kissing and affection travelled with the Vikings. You see, those burly seafarers weren't just raiders and warriors, they were also cultural sponges. Wherever they landed, whether smashing through monastery doors or suavely marrying into local dynasties, they absorbed, adapted, and sometimes outright stole customs. And kissing, that tender, complicated, sometimes magical little gesture, it seems to have arrived on Norse lips through contact with people they fought, traded with, and more often than you'd think, married. Start by picturing a Viking longship gliding silently toward a foggy coast, Ireland maybe, or the Frankish Empire. The sailors are salt-stained and serious, cloaked in wool and ambition. They've come for wealth, for land, maybe for glory, but not always for blood. In fact, many Viking settlements were established not by conquering, but by cozying up, trading, bargaining, even falling so in love. And that's when things got interesting. Let's take Ireland, for starters. The Norse presence there was long, complicated, and surprisingly affectionate, at least diplomatically. There were marriages between Norse men and Irish women, and with that cultural mingling came new rituals. The Irish, unlike the Vikings, did have a more established tradition of kissing, especially in greetings and ceremonies. So over time, these gestures started showing up in the Norse world too, not widespread at first, but noticeable. In certain pockets of Norse-Irish communities, people began to greet friends with a kiss on the cheek, or seal agreements with one. It wasn't romantic, it was practical, a sign of good faith, but it planted the seed. And then you've got the Franks. Oh boy, the Franks. If there was ever a culture obsessed with symbolic kissing, it was them. Courtly etiquette in Charlemagne's empire often included the kiss of peace, a gesture that could be religious, legal, or social, depending on the context. Vikings raiding Frankish monasteries and towns didn't just steal gold. They picked up new ideas, including weirdly specific etiquette. There's at least one account of a Norse chieftain who converted to Christianity and started enforcing kissing customs in his court that mirrored Frankish traditions. Scholars debate whether this was genuine faith, social strategy, or just an excuse to feel fancy. Honestly, probably all three. These cultural kisses weren't always one-sided, though. Just as Vikings adopted foreign customs, they brought their own ways of doing things. Their approach to affection, less about performance, more about depth, left a mark. Some of the communities they joined became hybrids. In places like York in England or Dublin in Ireland, you find this strange mix of Norse stoicism and Celtic sentimentality. People started blending rituals. A wedding might include both a Norse oath and an Irish blessing. A farewell might involve a firm handshake, a poetic stanza, and a cheek kiss. Multicultural affection, Viking style. There's even evidence that the Norse concept of love evolved as a result of these interactions. In the earlier sagas, love is usually expressed through loyalty, gifts, or vengeance. But in the later ones, especially those written down after prolonged contact with Christian Europe, you start to see characters kissing, tentatively, dramatically, sometimes even sweetly. Not often, but enough that you can spot the influence. Love becomes a bit more theatrical, less quiet sacrifice, more grand gesture. Still Viking, but with flair. A perfect example of this cultural blending is the story of Rollo, a Viking chieftain who became the first ruler of Normandy. He started out raiding the French coast and ended up marrying into royalty. Legend says he converted to Christianity and adopted Frankish customs, kissing included. In one famous scene, he was ordered to kiss the foot of the king as a sign of submission. Rollo refused. Instead, he had one of his warriors do it, who grabbed the king's ankle and lifted his whole leg up, toppling him backward. Technically, the kiss happened, but so did a political power move. That's very on-brand. There's also the Scandinavian integration into the Rus' territories, modern-day Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. These Viking-descended rulers absorbed tons of Slavic and Byzantine traditions. And guess what those cultures were big on? Yep, kissing, especially in religious and diplomatic contexts. The Russian tradition of the triple kiss in greetings likely has Byzantine roots, but once the Norse mixed into that world, they didn't stay immune. Kissing as part of social protocol became more normalised. Not necessarily romantic, but increasingly expected. And don't forget the Christian missionaries, spreading both scripture and kissing customs wherever they went. As Christianity spread north, so did its rituals, including the kiss of peace during Mass. In converted Norse communities, this religious kiss slowly found a place in weddings, funerals, even legal reconciliations. Imagine two former enemies, forced to make peace by law, reluctantly pressing cheeks together at a gathering, everyone watching, no pressure. Of course, not all Vikings embraced these customs with open arms. There was pushback, especially from the more traditional chieftains who viewed kissing, particularly in the public, as foreign nonsense, effeminate even. There's a line in one saga where a warrior mocks another for acting like a Frankish boy with his soft hands and sweet words. Translation: you kiss someone, and I hate that for you. Cultural clash, Viking edition. Still, the change was gradual and undeniable. Over generations, especially in settlements rather than homelands, kissing started to feel normal. Not universally, not casually, but as a slowly accepted part of social and emotional life. Something borrowed, adapted, and made slightly grimmer by the Norse sense of mortality. And maybe that's why it stuck. Because even if Vikings didn't invent kissing, they knew how to make it meaningful. They didn't use it often, but when they did, it mattered. Whether it was stolen from the Franks, blessed by a priest, or shared at a windswept wedding in a foreign land, the kiss became a new tool in the emotional toolkit, a foreign thing, but one they made their own. So now, in your quiet room, you drift into that picture. A Viking man in foreign clothes standing under a strange sky, holding the hand of someone who doesn't speak his language. They look at each other, not quite sure, not quite equal. And then, one kiss, hesitant, curious, a bridge between worlds, not love yet, but maybe something that could grow. All right, let's follow that thread of the foreign and the divine a little further, into the shadowy shimmer of myth. Tonight, we're heading into the realm of the Valkyrie, those warrior women of Norse legend who descended from the heavens not to kiss you gently under moonlight, but to choose whether you die in battle or live to see another sunrise. But don't let their grim job description fool you. The Valkyries were more than mere reapers of the fallen. They were symbols of fate, mystery, and occasionally a strange, ethereal affection. Because yes, in a few tales, even Valkyries kiss, but like everything else they do, it's not quite what you're expecting. First, the basics. Valkyries, whose name roughly translates to choosers of the slain, served Odin, the chief god of war, wisdom, and poetry. When warriors died in battle, the Valkyries decided who was worthy of being taken to Valhalla, the great hall of the honoured dead. They'd ride down on winged horses, or in some cases as swans or shimmering lights, gliding over the battlefield with spear in hand and judgment in their gaze. You didn't charm a Valkyrie, you impressed her, and if you were lucky, she might carry you to glory. But what happens when a Valkyrie lingers a little too long? When she sets aside her armour, steps into the mortal world and finds herself watching someone not just with divine detachment, but with something almost human. That's where the stories get intimate, and sometimes heartbreaking. Take the story of Sigurdrifa, a Valkyrie who appears in Sigurdrifamal, a poem within the Poetic Edda. She's discovered by the hero Sigurd, asleep in enchanted armour, behind a wall of fire. He awakens her, classic myth structure, and they talk. She shares wisdom, runes, secret knowledge, and yes, they kiss. It's subtle, brief. The text doesn't linger. But now the kiss is there, nestled among the advice about courage, justice, and fate. It's not romantic fluff. It's a moment of recognition, two fates colliding, and then, of course, it all falls apart. See, that's the thing with divine affection in Norse myth. It's rarely happy. A kiss from a Valkyrie isn't an invitation. It's often a goodbye, disguised as a blessing. In some stories, that kiss grants the mortal knowledge or madness. In others, it binds them together across lives, only to be torn apart again and again. It's tragic romance of the most Viking kind, brief, powerful, doomed. There's even a fringe variant of the Sigurdrifa tale, where the kiss is magical. Not just symbolic, but literally enchanted. Some scholars think it may have been a motif borrowed from other European legends, like the Sleeping Beauty style awakening kiss, but with a Norse twist. In this telling, the kiss not only wakes her, but seals Sigurd's fate. He's marked, chosen, and nothing he does from then on will break the curse. Another Valkyrie worth knowing is Brynhilda, whose story bleeds into Sigurd's as well. She's proud, powerful, and in some versions, literally burns to death after being betrayed in love. But before the downfall, there's often a kiss. Sometimes a greeting, sometimes a farewell. Occasionally it's left out entirely, replaced by eye contact so intense you can almost hear the saga narrator sweating. But when the kiss is included, it's treated like a lightning strike, transformative, irreversible. Not passion, fate. And what about mortal women becoming Valkyries? That's a theme too. In some sagas, a woman who shows exceptional bravery or magical skill is compared to a Valkyrie. If she kisses someone, it's rarely gentle. It's a test, a signal. I see you, it says. Now prove you're worthy. In Helga Kvida Hundingsbana, Helga, a Valkyrie or something close to it, falls in love with the hero Helgi. Their story spans multiple lifetimes, and though kisses are only hinted at, their bond feels stronger than time itself. When Helgi dies, Helga visits his barrow, kisses him, and lies down beside his corpse. Romantic? Yes. Healthy? Questionable. Pure Viking drama? Absolutely. Let's not skip over the more abstract idea of the kiss of death. Not just metaphorical, but almost ritualistic in these stories. Some versions of Valkyrie myths include a whisper, something spoken softly to a dying warrior just before they pass. A touch to the lips, a breath shared. Was it a kiss? Hard to say, but that moment, when a Valkyrie leans down over a bloodied fighter and murmurs something only he can hear, that's the real magic. It's as close as you get to tenderness in a world full of axes. There's also a less discussed scholarly theory that the Valkyrie kiss may have originally been a form of spiritual initiation. In shamanic traditions, the mouth was a powerful portal, used to breathe life, transfer spirits, share knowledge. A kiss from a Valkyrie then wasn't sensual, it was mystical, a way of marking the soul, opening it to divine paths. This would place the act somewhere between prophecy and possession. And honestly, with the way Valkyrie stories go, that checks out. And then there's the rare tale of the Valkyrie who stays. Instead of returning to Asgard or vanishing into mist, she falls in love with a mortal and tries to live among humans. Spoiler alert, it never ends well. The mortal inevitably betrays her, or forgets her, or fails her in some crucial moment. She vanishes, heartbroken, but in some versions she leaves behind a single kiss. Not to punish him, not to bless him, just to remember him. A whisper of what could never be. So what do we take from all this? That in Norse myth, a kiss is never just a kiss, especially from a Valkyrie. It's a spell, a verdict, a turning point. It might grant wisdom, ignite love, or doom your entire bloodline. But one thing's for sure, You don't forget it. Now, as you pull the blanket higher and listen to the quiet around you, picture it. A snow-covered battlefield, silent after the storm. A dying warrior, eyes open to the sky. And through the swirling snow, a figure approaches. Her armour gleams. Her face is unreadable. She kneels, touches his brow, and as her lips meet his, there's no warmth, only destiny. It's not the kiss he wanted, it's the one he earned. So far we've explored stolen kisses, ritual kisses, magical kisses, and even Valkyrie kisses. But now it's time to get domestic. Let's talk marriage. Not the dreamy fairy tale version, but the gritty goat dowry honour contract type of marriage the Vikings practiced. You might assume that if there were ever a socially acceptable time for a public kiss, it would be at a wedding, right? Wrong! Buckle up, because Viking weddings were full of ceremony, drinking, sacred oaths, and sometimes dramatic sword-point negotiations. But kissing? That's complicated. First, let's set the scene. You're in a small clearing on a summer day somewhere in Norway or Iceland. People have gathered from the neighbouring farms and settlements. There's food, ale, fiddles, or whatever the Viking equivalent of party music was, and everyone's wearing their least terrifying furs. Two families stand facing each other like rival sports teams. The bride is veiled, probably quiet. The groom might be nervous or smug, depending on how arranged this whole thing was, and at the centre of it all is the bryllup, the Viking wedding ceremony. But let's get one thing straight from the start. Viking marriages weren't built around romance. They were practical, contractual, and deeply social. The couple might like each other, they might not. What mattered most were alliances. A wedding was a merger. Land, power, reputation, sometimes even grudges stitched together and buried under a mountain of mead. Parents made the arrangements. Witnesses were crucial, and everything had to be documented, not in paper, but in memory. Words were sacred, so were gestures. So what role did kissing play in all this? Surprisingly little. There's no record of a Viking bride and groom kissing at the altar. None of the sagas mention it, not even as a passing detail. It doesn't show up in the laws either, not as a requirement or a tradition. Instead, the moment that marked a marriage wasn't a kiss. It was the hand-fasting, the physical joining of hands in front of witnesses, a literal binding of two people under the gaze of the gods. If that sounds familiar, it should. Hand-fasting continued for centuries, eventually becoming a staple in many medieval and even modern pagan ceremonies. After the vows were made, gifts were exchanged. The groom gave the bride a sword, sometimes one from his ancestors, symbolising her entry into his lineage. She might give him a key to her future home. These were acts of mutual trust and responsibility. Powerful, symbolic, but still no kissing. Even at the feast, the newlyweds weren't expected to publicly smooch. They might sit beside each other, drink from the same horn, or even make a subtle toast that implied affection. But lip contact? That was private. The party might be wild with dancing and songs about gods who turned into horses to seduce people. Seriously, Norse myths are wild. But the bride and groom kept it buttoned up. For now. Of course, the real drama came after the feast. The bridal bed was a serious moment full of ritual. In some traditions, the community escorted the couple to bed with jokes and songs. A rowdy parade that may or may not have included tipsy elders shouting, "Make an heir," in Old Norse. Sometimes close friends stayed behind to witness the bedding. Yes, that's exactly as awkward as it sounds. The idea was to verify that the marriage had been consummated, which was necessary for the union to count. It was less about privacy and more about legal and social validation. So was there kissing in the bridal chamber? Probably. That's where the barriers came down. Alone, away from the crowd, that's where intimacy could finally unfold. It wasn't documented, though. What happened after the furs closed around the newlyweds stayed there, but you can imagine it, can't you? After all the performance, the ritual, the drinking, the long glances, they are finally still. Maybe a little nervous, maybe a little giddy, and that's when the first kiss happens, quiet, slow, real. Some fringe tales suggest that kisses did happen during wedding feasts, but only when there was a second marriage. If a widow or widower remarried, the ceremony was more relaxed, less political, less performative. In those cases, the couple might lean in and kiss, especially if they were already known to be lovers beforehand. It wasn't expected, but it wasn't scandalous either. More like an inside joke with the gods. There's also a mention in Cormac's saga where the skald Cormac falls in love with Steingudr, but is cursed by a sorceress and fails to show up to his wedding. The wedding goes on without him, and Steingerder marries someone else. The story includes no kissing, no touching, just an overwhelming sense of regret. But some scholars argue that the curse and the skipped wedding is metaphorical, that Cormac loses his chance at love because he never seals it. Not with a vow, not with a kiss. It's a silence that echoes louder than any song. As Christianity began to creep into Norse culture, things shifted. Christian weddings did include kisses. The peace kiss was part of the early church's ritual, and as Viking society Christianized, especially in the 10th and 11th centuries, these customs started appearing in marriage rites. A kiss on the mouth or the cheek became part of sealing the union, representing both physical and spiritual union. This was new, and a little uncomfortable for some. Older generations scoffed. Kissing was still intimate, private. Bringing it into a sacred ceremony? Bold. Yet the change stuck. Within a few generations, kissing at weddings, at least among the Christianized elite, was accepted. In some regions, it even became expected. The kiss didn't just mean affection. It meant legitimacy. It meant unity. It meant, we've entered into something holy and everyone here knows it. So now, back in your soft bed, the hum of night stretching around you, you picture it. Two people hand-clasped in the cool air of an open field. They speak their vows. They share mead. Their families nod in approval, and later, long after the fire dies down and the revellers drift off, the curtain is drawn. In the hush of that moment, lips meet for the first time, not as strangers, not as pawns in a political game, but as something new, something chosen. That's the Viking wedding kiss. Not loud, not public, but sacred all the same. Now that we've tiptoed through Viking weddings and the sacred silence of the private kiss, let's do something completely different. Let's look at how Viking law viewed intimacy. Because, surprise, even in a culture where warriors got more poetic over their swords than their spouses, there were rules. And when it came to things like kissing, touching, and whatever counted as seduction in a world without candles or Barry White, the Norse legal codes had thoughts. Some were strict, some were shockingly modern, and some, well, let's just say they were as odd as a goat on a longship. Let's start with one of the major texts, Sagas, the medieval Icelandic law code. The name literally means grey goose, which is adorable considering how unfluffy its contents are. These were the rules that governed Viking-era Iceland from roughly the 10th to 13th centuries. They covered everything from property disputes to murder to, yes, what happened if someone laid hands on another person's wife, daughter, or servant. Now, kissing doesn't show up a lot in Sagas, at least not directly, but what does appear is a cluster of laws around clam, shameful behaviour, need, insults to honour, and the boundaries of physical contact. And in many of these, touching someone inappropriately, especially someone else's spouse, was considered a serious offence. Even a kiss, if seen as unsolicited or dishonourable, could trigger fines, revenge, or both. Picture this: a man kisses another man's wife at a feast. Maybe he's drunk, maybe he thinks he's being charming. Either way, if it's seen and publicly acknowledged, he's just crossed a very dangerous line. The offended husband could demand compensation, or if the insult to his honour was deemed severe enough, he might challenge the kisser to a duel. Because what you just did wasn't romance, it was an act of aggression. In a society where personal reputation was currency, kissing without permission wasn't cute, it was potentially fatal. But what if the woman kissed the man? That's trickier. In some sagas, bold women use affection as a power move. If she was unmarried, or if the kiss happened in private, there might be no legal consequences, just social ones. But if she were married and it became public knowledge, that was adultery, and adultery laws were brutal. Here's where the contradictions start. A man could often take concubines or sleep with lower status women without legal penalty, as long as he wasn't violating the rights of another man, meaning he couldn't seduce a married woman or someone else's thrall. Women, on the other hand, were held to stricter standards. A kiss might be ignored, or it might be used as evidence in a broader accusation, and if things escalated to a full affair, that could end with divorce, fines, or in some sagas, axe-related consequences. Take Njal's saga, where Halgadur Höskuldsdottir gets tangled in multiple scandals, including flirtations, backtalk, and possible infidelity. There's no kissing scene per se, but the social tension is real. One wrong move, even a suggestive word or an affectionate gesture, could unravel a household's entire standing. These weren't just personal matters, they were communal. Now, if we zoom out to the broader Scandinavian region, other legal codes echo this pattern. In early Swedish and Danish laws, there are references to seduction that don't mention kissing directly, but include dishonouring a woman with hands or mouth. That phrase, with hands or mouth, has been debated by scholars for centuries. Was it metaphorical? Literal? Did it include a kiss? Some think yes, especially if that kiss was non-consensual or publicly scandalous. And then there's need, one of the strangest, most complicated legal concepts in Viking culture. Need was an insult to someone's honour, usually implying weakness, cowardice or perversion. You didn't throw around accusations of need lightly, it was considered verbal warfare. And here's the kicker. Sometimes kissing was used as an insult. In a few tales, one man might kiss another mockingly, essentially calling him effeminate or submissive. That wasn't a gesture of affection, it was a provocation. And if you didn't answer it with violence, you were publicly shamed. There's one particularly wild fringe example, a story about a man who was insulted by being accused of kissing too sweetly. Yes, too sweetly, the implication being that he was soft, unmanly, possibly not to be trusted with a sword or a woman. That sounds ridiculous now, but in Viking society, where masculinity was guarded like treasure, a kiss could carry the weight of accusation. And what about love spells? Oh yes, those too were touched by law. In some Icelandic texts, using galder, magic, to win someone's affection was considered a criminal act. If you enchanted someone into kissing or loving you, that wasn't seen as romantic, it was coercion. You could be fined, exiled or worse. This wasn't just superstition, it was an early understanding that consent mattered, even if expressed in the language of runes and charms. Of course, none of this means the Vikings were loveless robots spouting legal threats every time someone leaned in. Kissing happened, so did flirting, touching, private gestures. But the fact that so much of it had legal and social boundaries tells you something. Affection, when public or controversial, was powerful, powerful enough to be dangerous. And sometimes the law wasn't about punishment at all, it was protection. Women could divorce their husbands if they were abused, humiliated or wronged. If a man publicly shamed his wife by, say, kissing another woman in front of her, she had grounds to end the marriage. That's not nothing. In a world ruled by honour, even how you kissed could shape your future. So now let your eyes flutter shut and picture this. A crowded Thingstead, a Viking legal assembly, held in a windswept field. Two families stand on opposite sides. Voices rise, accusations fly. Somewhere in the centre of it all, the reason for this chaos is simple. A kiss. Maybe it was wanted, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe, to the people who saw it, it meant everything. Because in the Viking world, even something as small as a kiss could tip the scales of fate. So you've just been accused of kissing someone you maybe shouldn't have. Or maybe you're just hopelessly in love with a shield maiden who doesn't know you exist. Either way, you're desperate at it. You need help. You don't need poetry or a pep talk, you need magic. Welcome to the shadowy, rune-scribbled world of Viking love spells, where carving a few mysterious symbols onto a stick might just win you a kiss, or curse you forever. Yes, tonight we're talking about runes of romance, Viking-era love magic, and the belief that with the right incantation and a little reckless carving, you could force fate, and maybe a pair of lips, to bend your way. Start with the basics. Runes weren't just letters, they were thought to carry power. Each rune had a name, a sound and a meaning, and the Vikings didn't just write with them, they invoked them. Carved into bones, wood, stones, weapons, even skin. These weren't decorations, they were spells, prayers, warnings, and sometimes they were love notes. Imagine you're a young Viking with a hopeless crush on someone who barely acknowledges your existence during feast days. You don't have a lute or roses. What you do have is a knife, a chunk of birch, and a working knowledge of the Elder Futhark. So you sneak off into the woods, whispering under your breath, and start to carve. A name, a symbol, a charm for attraction. And when you're done, you slip it into her food, her bed, or bury it under her threshold. If you're lucky, she starts to notice you. If you're not, well, she starts screaming and her father grabs his axe. There's a fascinating scene in Egil's saga that captures this perfectly. Egil, a warrior and poet, discovers a woman who's fallen mysteriously ill. Turns out some fool tried to win her over using carved runes, but he didn't know what he was doing. The runes were sloppy, dangerous, and instead of making her love him, they made her sick. Egil scrapes off the bad runes, carves his own, correctly, and voila, she recovers. It's one of the few literary moments that hints at how serious rune magic was, and how badly it could go if misused. But not all love spells were carved. Some were sung. Galder, Norse magical chanting, could be used for all kinds of purposes, including love. The idea was to sing specific syllables in a certain rhythm, weaving emotion, intention, and cosmic authority into the air. The right chant could make someone dream of you, or long for you, or again, throw up and run away depending on your pronunciation. It was dangerous, unstable magic, and it worked best when mixed with runes. So what kinds of runes were used? The most commonly cited one is Gibo, which looks like an X and symbolises gift-giving and connection, mutual exchange. A popular theory is that Gibo was included in love spells to represent emotional or physical union. There's also Wunjo, the rune of joy and harmony, and Berkano, associated with feminine energy, fertility and growth. You don't just want attraction, you want reciprocity, peace, a future. At least that's the romantic version. The more sinister version. Use Isa, the ice rune, to freeze someone's heart. Nauthiz, the rune of need. To stir obsession. Romantic? Not exactly. Effective? Maybe. Some surviving rune sticks even include partial spells, often cloaked in cryptic language. One famous example is the Love Stick, found in Bergen, Norway. It reads, "May you love me as I love you." Simple, sweet, desperate. It's unclear whether it was meant as a charm, a declaration, or both. Either way, someone carved those words by hand, hoping to conjure not just attention, but mutual affection. But let's pause for a second, because this is where the ethics get murky. Many of these love spells, while poetic in theory, were essentially coercive. They weren't just hoping for a first kiss. They were attempting to override free will, carve the right runes, sing the right chant, and someone would want you, whether they planned to or not. That makes modern readers squirm, and rightfully so, but in the Viking Age, magic was part of everyday survival. Love, like war or weather, could be manipulated. And of course, women used magic too. In fact, in many cases, they were better at it. Seeresses, known as völer, practiced Sida, Norse sorcery, and were often feared and respected. Some love spells may have come from them. But ordinary women used magic as well. There's a fragment from the Galdrabok, an Icelandic grimoire written centuries later, but rooted in older traditions, that includes a spell to bring someone's heart to longing. Ingredients? A raven feather, a drop of your blood, and a kiss blown into the wind while chanting their name backward. Creepy? Yes, kind of cool. Also yes. The kiss in this context wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was symbolic. A kiss blown into the air was meant to carry your essence, your desire, to the person you wanted. A kind of psychic nudge. Other times, the kiss was the final step in the spell. After carving your runes, you'd press your lips to them, sealing the magic. That one little act could tie your soul to someone's for eternity, or until they found the stick and threw it in a bog. Some fringe researchers even believe that kissing certain natural objects, a tree, a stone, a pool of water, could transfer your intention into the world. Folk belief held that the world was alive and listening, so if you wanted to kiss someone but couldn't, you might kiss a stone and whisper their name, hoping the world would pass along the message. Primitive? Maybe, but weirdly romantic too. And sometimes the magic wasn't about winning affection, it was about keeping it. Married couples might carve protective runes into their bedposts or gift each other small talismans inscribed with love charms. These weren't flashy, they were practical magic. Insurance policies for the heart. So now imagine yourself standing alone in a pine forest, the wind cold against your face, a scrap of wood in your palm. You've carved the runes, you whisper their name, you press your lips to the symbol, sealing it. And for one long moment you believe in love, in magic, in the sim flickering chance that this time your desire might reach them. That's not a kiss they'll feel on their skin. It's one they'll feel in their bones. Let's take a little detour now, a detour straight into your nostrils. Because tonight, we're going to talk about something that's always hanging in the background of Viking affection, but never quite gets the attention it deserves. Hygiene. Yep, the smell factor, the breath behind the kiss, the Viking-era dental plan, or lack thereof. Because before we go on waxing poetic about passionate Norse smooches, we have to ask the obvious: what did these people smell like? And would anyone even want to kiss them? Let's start with the good news. Vikings were, by early medieval standards, actually pretty clean. Not spade clean, but compared to their contemporaries in many parts of Europe, they made a real effort. Excavations at Viking settlements like Dublin and York have turned up grooming tools: combs, tweezers, ear picks, razors, all carved from bone or antler. Imagine a bearded raider carefully oiling his hair, combing out knots, plucking stray brow hairs with bone tweezers. Not exactly barbaric, huh? Bathing was a regular thing too. The Old Norse word laugardag, the root of modern Saturday in Scandinavian languages, literally means washing day. On Saturdays people would bathe. Hot water was heated in large wooden tubs, and families took turns soaking and scrubbing off the week's dirt. No scented bubbles or loofahs, but still a clear routine. And if you're wondering whether people bathed before weddings or romantic meetings, the sagas don't say, but come on, wouldn't you? Still, let's not go too far down the fantasy rabbit hole. These were people who lived in close quarters, wore heavy wool in all seasons, and did a lot of physical labour. Sweat happened, fish happened, animal fat happened. Most homes had open hearths, so everything and everyone smelled like a smoke. Laundry was washed in streams with lye, which was great for getting out bloodstains but didn't leave you exactly floral. And that brings us to breath. If you're imagining steamy, mead-scented Viking kisses, prepare to adjust your expectations. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, and no mint. People might chew herbs like angelica or fennel, or use a rough cloth to scrape their teeth, but dental hygiene was hit or miss. Some skeletons show worn teeth and gum disease, others show surprisingly clean enamel, so it's a mixed bag. If you were lucky, your partner's mouth tasted like herbs. If not, fermented fish and ale. Kissing was, in a very real sense, an act of courage, and yet, despite the funk factor, personal grooming mattered. Vikings judged each other by appearance. A well-kept beard meant discipline. Clean fingernails suggested status. There's even a story in Grettir's saga where Grettir refuses to fight until he washes and combs his hair. Priorities. Now, let's talk clothing and smell. Vikings layered their garments: linen underclothes, wool tunics, cloaks, fur wraps. These didn't get washed often, but they were cared for. Lice and fleas were a constant battle, so people used smoke, ash and herbal sachets to repel them. The descent of juniper or birch smoke was common, half deodorant, half perfume. If your clothes smelled like a clean fire, that was considered pretty attractive. There's a fringe theory that Vikings also used scented oils. Not like modern cologne, but animal fat mixed with crushed herbs or resin. Rubbed into hair or beards, these would keep lice away and soften coarse strands, but they'd also smell strongly. So your average Viking man might walk around with his hair slicked back, his beard gleaming, and the sharp scent of pine tar or birch resin following him like a personal storm cloud. Whether that made kisses more appealing or less probably depended on how long you'd been stuck on the same longship. Speaking of ships, sea salt. It gets into everything. Hair, skin, clothes, breath. For people who spent weeks or months raiding or travelling by boat, that briny smell became part of them. So did smoke from their campfires. It's not sexy in the conventional sense, but in a weird way it's consistent. Predictable, familiar, the smell of someone who survived the same storms you have. But hygiene wasn't just about smell, it was also about symbolism. Cleanliness often meant readiness. Preparing for battle, bathe first, hosting guests, wash your hands and face, courting someone, comb your hair, maybe trim your beard. Even in a society where overt kissing was rare, preparation for closeness still mattered. You didn't just show up dirty and expect affection. There was effort. In fact, there's a passage in the Havamal, that book of Viking wisdom poetry, that specifically mentions grooming. It says, "A man should be wise in counsel, clean in appearance. That's Old Norse for no one's kissing you with squirrel fur in your teeth." Cleanliness wasn't vanity, it was respect. But there's another angle here, one that hits a little closer to the heart. When someone did get close enough to kiss you, especially in a culture where such gestures were rare and deeply charged, what you smelled like might not matter. Or rather, it mattered in a different way. The smoke in your hair, the salt on your skin, the scent of iron and pine and damp wool, those weren't turn-offs. They were signs that you lived, that you'd endured, that you were still warm and breathing in a world that could take that away in an instant. So maybe, just maybe, the fact that someone leaned in anyway, despite the brine and the fish and the faint smell of boiled goat, meant the kiss mattered even more. It wasn't about freshness, it was about familiarity, recognition, desire not in spite of your wildness, but because of it. So as you settle deeper into your blanket and the room cools with the hush of night, picture this. A quiet moment after a long journey. You haven't bathed in days, your feet are sore, your hair is tangled, and someone sits beside you in the firelight. They lean in, noses nearly touching. They know exactly what you smell like, and they kiss you anyway. Not because you're clean, but because you're you. Now that we've scrubbed off the sea salt and braved the mead breath, let's shift from mortals back to the divine, specifically to the goddess Freyja, the big league Norse deity of love, beauty, fertility, and all things that make people blush in a longhouse. If there's anyone who might have strong opinions about kissing, it's her. She's not just the patron of romantic energy, she's the beating heart of every saga where desire, seduction, and dangerous longing crash headfirst into fate. But don't be fooled, Freya isn't your soft-focused love goddess. She's fierce, complicated, and perfectly capable of kissing you one moment and hexing you the next. Start with the basics. Freya is a Vanir goddess, part of a tribe that specialises in fertility, nature, and the squishier, more mysterious forces of the universe. After a truce, she joins the Aesir, Odin, Thor, Loki, and the like, and becomes one of the most powerful figures in Asgard. She drives a chariot pulled by cats. She weeps tears of gold. She wears a cloak made of falcon feathers and owns a necklace. Brisingamen, that's the stuff of divine fashion lore. And depending on the story, she gets what she wants, whether that's lovers, magical artifacts, or revenge. So where does kissing fit into her mythology? Well, it's complicated. The texts don't exactly say Freya was a great kisser, but they don't need to. Her entire mythos pulses with the kind of intimate power that would make a kiss from her feel like both a blessing and a dare. She is the goddess you call on when you want love and lust, fertility and fury. And in some sagas, her affections are gifts and weapons. One of the more infamous tales involves her necklace, Brisingamen. According to Sturla Thatta, a late and Christian-influenced source, read Interpret with Caution, Freya desires the necklace so badly that she sleeps with 4 dwarves to obtain it. Is there a kiss in that story? It's not mentioned, but the subtext screams it. Her body, her beauty, her divine sensuality, these are her tools, her choice. The kiss may be off-page, but it's implied. Not for pleasure, not even for love, for power. This gets to the core of Freyja's role in Norse culture. She owns her sexuality. In a mythological landscape where gods and mortals alike treat desire like a weakness or a trap, Freyja uses it as a form of control. If she kissed you, it wouldn't be out of shyness. It would be because she wanted something, and she probably already knew she was going to get it. But Freyja isn't just about conquest. She's also a goddess of Saga, Norse sorcery, which is deeply tied to the manipulation of fate and emotion. A kiss from Freyja might do more than flutter your heart. It might alter your destiny. Some folkloric traditions even describe her as a figure who could enchant through touch, mouth to mouth or hand to hand. There's a whisper of belief that her kiss could reveal your truest longing, or strip away illusions. Imagine a kiss that shows you who you really are. Now, there's also tension in Freyja's stories. The sagas love to shame her. She's accused of sleeping with all the gods, with her own brother, with entire armies, most of which are probably just slander from insecure male deities. Loki, ever the gossip, publicly accuses her of various affairs in Lokasenna, a poem that's basically a divine roast session. But Freya never apologises. She doesn't deny. She just seethes and survives. Her defiance is part of what makes her so compelling. She doesn't back down from her power, and she never explains herself. In some interpretations, Freyja is seen as a mirror of human desire, fickle, wild, passionate, but others view her as the embodiment of sacred love, the kind that's chaotic and creative and totally uncontainable. Her kisses, if and when they happened, weren't the sweet pecks of romantic novels. They were rituals, acts of transformation, maybe even transactions. They said, "You are mine for now," and that was enough. There's also a lesser-known myth that casts Freyr as the lover of a mortal man, Otter. He's a quiet, devout follower who builds a shrine to her, and in return she helps improve his noble lineage by seeking wisdom from the giantess Hyndla. Now, there's no explicit kissing in this tale, but their relationship is tender, unusual. He's not a warrior, he's not flashy, he just believes in her, and she rewards that belief not with seduction, but with knowledge. Still, you can imagine a quiet moment, a touch of her hand, a kiss to his brow before vanishing into smoke and starlight. In modern neo-paganism, Freyr has been embraced as a symbol of empowered love. Love that doesn't need permission, doesn't apologise, and absolutely doesn't wait to be chosen. Devotees sometimes offer her kisses blown into candles or whispered into the wind. It's not historical, but it's fitting. She's still kissing across centuries in a way. Some fringe scholars even propose that Freyja's influence over fertility extended to wedding customs, and that in pre-Christian rituals, couples might have invoked her during the blot, a sacrificial ceremony, by sharing a first kiss in her name. It's speculative, and evidence is thin, but the idea has poetic weight. A kiss given under the eyes of the goddess of desire as both vow and offering. But Freyja isn't love without consequences. She chooses half the dead in battle. Those who don't go to Odin's Valhalla end up in her hall, Folkvanger. So even in death she selects. The kiss of Freyja, metaphorically speaking, might not just bless you with love, it might also choose your final resting place. Intimacy with her isn't just about pleasure, it's about fate. So now, as your room darkens and the hum of night curls around your bed like one of Freyja's cats, imagine it. A woman cloaked in falcon feathers, golden tears shining on her cheeks, her eyes ancient and knowing. She steps close. You don't ask why, you don't look away. She leans in and kisses you. It's not gentle, it's not cruel, it's a threshold. You were someone else before, you'll never be the same after. You've been kissed by Freyja. Metaphorically, of course, and now you're changed, or cursed, or maybe just incredibly confused. But tonight, we move from divine seduction to something even deeper in the Viking soul. Oaths, sworn promises, vows made with spit, blood, and sometimes kisses. That's right. In the Norse world, a kiss wasn't always about love or even attraction. It could be something far more serious, a seal, a bond, a kind of spiritual superglue. Because when a Viking said, "I swear," they meant it, and sometimes they meant it with their lips. Let's start with what an oath actually was to the Vikings. It wasn't just words, it was a public binding declaration that could tie you to someone for life, or doom you if broken. Oaths were spoken before witnesses, often on sacred objects like Thor's hammer, or a ring blessed by a chieftain. And if you broke your word, the consequences weren't just social, they were cosmic. You risked angering the gods, losing your honour, and becoming what they called Nidinga, a dishonoured person, a walking stain no one would deal with. Not a great look. Now, most oaths were sealed in expected ways, gripping hands, sharing blood, sometimes even walking under an archway of spears. But every now and then there's a hint, just a whisper, that a kiss might have played a part too, especially in what we might call blood brotherhoods, sworn bonds between men who pledged loyalty deeper than family. In these rare and legendary relationships, a kiss wasn't romantic, it was symbolic, a gesture of unity. One of the most famous tales is that of Ingolfur Arnason, the settler of Iceland, and his foster brother Hjörleifr. The sagas don't say they kissed, but they do emphasise the strength of their bond. They share wealth, vengeance and legacy, and in other, less well-known accounts of foster brothers or sworn allies, there's mention of cheek kisses or mouth-to-mouth greetings as part of the oath ritual. It's debated, of course. Some scholars call it poetic license, others see it as cultural truth, but in either case it paints a picture. Two warriors face to face, making a vow with more than words. There's a fringe theory that such a kiss might have been considered sacred, a literal breath-sharing. In many pre-modern cultures, breath was life. A kiss, especially a closed-mouth one, could be a symbolic mingling of spirits. You weren't just pledging your loyalty, you were binding your fate to theirs, until death, sometimes beyond. But it wasn't just between warriors. Lovers too made oaths. In the sagas, we occasionally find scenes where a man and a woman pledge themselves to each other without marriage, secretly, dangerously. They can't be together officially, so they swear vows in the dark beside a stream or beneath a tree far from watching eyes. And while the sagas often skip the details, the tone is charged. You can feel the kiss hanging in the silence, unspoken, unwritten, but there, a promise sealed not just with words but with mouths. Of course, the kiss seal didn't always go well. Take Cormac's saga again, our tragic poet friend, forever unlucky in love. At one point, he and his beloved Steingirda make a private vow to be together. No formal wedding, just a shared promise. But something goes wrong. A curse, a misunderstanding, and everything unravels. There's no mention of a kiss in the text, but if it happened, it became a curse itself. Not a bond, but a chain. Some scholars argue that these kiss seals were inspired by or borrowed from Christian customs. In Christian rites, the kiss of peace was used to close deals, reconcile enemies, and even seal marriages. As Christianity crept into the Norse world, especially in the later Viking Age, it's possible that kissing as an oath sealer began to sneak into Norse practice too, first through ritual, then through personal habit. But others insist that the idea predates the cross, that in the Norse worldview the kiss already had power, it just wasn't used lightly. And speaking of power, there's a chilling little category of Norse magic known as fjölkingi, which included using bodily gestures in sorcery. Some late Icelandic grimoires describe the kiss of binding, where a magician kisses an object, a sword, a ring, a strand of hair, to charge it with intent. That kiss, once given, ties the object to its purpose. If the same logic applied to people, then a kiss during an oath wasn't just symbolic, it was magical, a trigger, an unspoken spell. There's also the practical side. Imagine two people sealing a secret. It's dark, no one else can hear. A kiss, quick, quiet, might be the final act, not affection but assurance. I've said the words, I've made the promise, now remember me. It's private, unrecorded, but real. We even see echoes of this in modern Scandinavian storytelling. Old folk tales feature scenes where a kiss given during a pact lingers as a mark. Someone tries to break their word, but the kiss burns on their lips. Their dreams turn sour. Their mouth tastes of ash. They've broken the seal, and now the consequences follow. So now, lie still, listening to the night settle into your room like snow falling in a quiet forest. Picture two people, maybe warriors, maybe lovers, maybe both, standing in the shadows of a sacred grove. They speak no more than necessary. One reaches out, their fingers touch, and then, without ceremony, one leans forward and presses a kiss to the other's lips. It's not passion, not performance, it's a vow. No one saw it, but the gods did. Tonight, we step into the shadows, because not all kisses in the Viking world were given freely. Some were taken, some were used as tools, weapons, or traps, and nowhere was that tension sharper than in the dark, messy aftermath of Viking raids. You know the picture. Longships slicing through sea mist, warriors leaping ashore, torches blazing, villages burning. But what happened after the battle, once the loot was counted and the blood washed off? That's where things get murky and deeply uncomfortable. Because as much as we love to mythologize Viking valor, we also have to face the reality. Affection and conquest often collided, and consent was far from guaranteed. Let's begin with the raids themselves. From the late 700s to the 11th century, Vikings launched attacks across Europe. Monasteries, coastal towns, wealthy farms. But they didn't just take gold and cattle, they took people. Women and children were often captured and brought back as slaves. Thralls in Norse terms. And in that brutal power imbalance, intimacy became something else entirely. If a woman was kissed by her captor, it wasn't romance, it was dominance, a claiming, a declaration that her autonomy had been taken with the rest of her world. And yet, the sagas rarely describe this directly. They are surprisingly evasive about sexual violence. Some scholars argue this is deliberate, that the violence was so common it didn't need narration. Others suggest the authors, writing centuries later and often under Christian influence, sanitized the stories. Either way, the silence is loud. You have to read between the lines. Take Laxdæla Saga, where we meet Melkorka, an Irish princess taken during a raid and sold as a thrall in Iceland. Her story is heartbreaking. She doesn't speak, literally. For much of the tale, she's mute, and only later reveals her true name and identity. her silence is its own kind of scream. The man who purchases her, Höskuldur, eventually marries her, and they have a son. But did she choose that life? Did she love him? Did she kiss him, or was she kissed at? The saga doesn't say, and that omission tells you everything. The Viking Age was a time when marriage, love, and captivity often blurred. A woman captured in a raid might be made a concubine, or she might, over time, become a wife. In some cases, her children rose to prominence, like Melkorka's son, who became a respected chieftain. But that doesn't erase the origin. It just makes it more complicated. What kind of kiss is born from survival? And this wasn't limited to women. Boys were taken too. Some became foster sons, servants, or even lovers, especially in the Eastern Viking world, where Norse men mingled with Slavic and Byzantine cultures. There are hints in Russ's history of young captives becoming part of elite households, their relationships with their captors never fully defined. Was there affection? Possibly. Was there choice? Unlikely. Still, not every captive story ends in silence. In a few rare cases, the captured woman gains power. She marries her captor, then slowly climbs the ranks, first influencing his household, then his politics. One obscure tale from the Orkneyinga saga features a Scottish noblewoman taken in a raid who ends up ruling over a Norse settlement after her captor dies. Did she ever kiss him? Did she fake affection to stay alive? Or did something real develop over time, forged in fire and necessity? Again, the sagas don't spell it out, but the possibilities haunt the margins. There's also a strange little thread running through Norse folk belief, the idea that a kiss could transform ownership into attachment, a kind of psychological tether. Some poems refer to the mark of the mouth, suggesting that a woman who is kissed by a captor might become emotionally bound to him, whether through trauma, spell, or fate. It's a deeply problematic idea, but one that appears across cultures. The belief that affection, however twisted, can be forged from violence. Modern scholars are sharply divided on this. Some view it as an early, awful example of Stockholm Syndrome. Others argue it reflects the Norse obsession with fate. Once paths cross, even through brutality, lives are entangled. Still others say these stories are male fantasies, dressed up as destiny. Whatever the interpretation, they remind us that the Viking world, like any world, included people trying to survive inside systems that didn't care about their agency. But what about the rare stories of true connection between captor and captive? Did they exist? Probably. People are strange and messy and adaptable. Love sometimes grows in the most unlikely places, not as an excuse but as a reality. Maybe there was a woman who looked across the longhouse fire at the man who had once chained her and saw something else, or a man who learned to treat the girl he stole not as property, but as equal. And maybe, just once, there was a kiss not born of fear or power, but of something genuine. If so, the sagas didn't bother to write it down, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And here's the truly uncomfortable twist. Some Viking women participated in raids, shieldmaidens, female warriors. Not common, but not unheard of. And while their presence on the battlefield was often ceremonial or symbolic, it raises difficult questions. Could a woman fighting alongside men also take captives? Kiss someone as a symbol of conquest? Possibly. History doesn't give us a clear answer, but the possibility. There's one eerie tale from the Faroe Islands about a woman who seduces her husband's enemy during a war, kisses him while he sleeps, then slits his throat. It's more folk horror than romance, but it captures something true. Even kisses that seem soft can be sharpened into blades. So now, with the weight of all this history settling into the quiet space around you, imagine this. A woman on a foreign shore standing beside the man who stole her from her home. She hasn't spoken in days. He offers food, shelter, a place in his house. One night she sits beside him watching the fire, and slowly she leans in, not out of affection, not yet, but curiosity, survival, calculation. Their lips meet, just once, and the next morning everything has changed. You've seen the kiss as comfort, curse, magic, manipulation and mourning, but now it's time for something quieter, almost gentle, the kiss in poetry. Because if the Vikings didn't always go around kissing people in public or writing steamy love scenes into their sagas, they still had another outlet for all that emotion. Verse. And Viking poetry wasn't all blood and blades. It had room for longing, for heartbreak, and yes, for the whispered, implied, and metaphorical kiss. Tonight, we're diving into the world of skaldic verse, where affection gets hidden behind kennings and wordplay sharp enough to cut through armour. Start with the skalds themselves. These were the poets of the Viking world, respected, sometimes feared, and often employed by kings to compose praise poems, insults, or memorial verses. Being a skald wasn't just about rhyming, it was about wielding language like a weapon. Their verse structures were maddeningly complex. Strict meter, layered metaphors, internal rhyme. This wasn't the kind of poetry you dashed off on a napkin. This was performance, prestige, power. But even these hardened poets had soft spots. In fact, some of the earliest examples of Old Norse love poetry come from skalds who couldn't resist pouring their feelings into verse. They didn't come out and say, "I kissed her," of course. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they cloaked desire in kennings, those delightful, twisted, compound metaphors the Norse loved so much. A woman wasn't a woman. She was a wound healer, a mead tree, a mind joy. A kiss? Well, you had to read between the lines. Take Cormaca Ögmundarson. Yes, him again. A skald whose saga survives as a mixture of narrative and preserved poems. Cormaca was obsessed with a woman named Steingerda. Their love was a mess, full of missed chances, curses, fights, and fate getting in the way. He wrote poems to her throughout his life, and while they never explicitly describe a kiss, the longing is thick. In one, he compares her smile to the sun breaking through battle smoke. In another, he writes that he would walk through fire just to be near her breath. That's about as romantic as a Viking gets. And then there's Egil Skallagrimsson, warrior, poet, professional grump. Most of his surviving poetry is elegy, deep, devastating laments for lost family. But once in a while, a softer line slips in. In a poem mourning his sons, he remembers his wife not with passion, but with gentleness. She closed my hand around the cup of silence. That sounds like a moment where a kiss might live, quietly implied. Not for show, for solace. But it's not just about men longing for women. There are poems where the perspective is reversed, either literally in later retellings, or metaphorically, through the way desire is described. One fragment from the Eddic poem The Lay of Skirnir includes a threatening love spell cast by a god's servant to force a woman into marriage. It's twisted, coercive, and very uncomfortable, but it ends with the line, "You shall be as the goat in heat, the woman with no will, kissing the air with thirst." That's not a love poem, that's a power spell, but it shows how deeply physical gestures like kissing had seeped into the poetic language. Still, not all kiss-adjacent poetry was so dark. There are fragments that feel like true affection, lines about meeting mouths or sharing breath. These were coded, cautious, and often tucked into praise poems hidden among tributes to swordplay and ship speed. A warrior might slip in a single line about the warmth of the joy woman's lips, or the mouth music of my night, and no one would blink. Poetry gave them cover. It let them say what they couldn't in daylight. And sometimes the kiss didn't appear at all, but the space where it should have, that's where the real ache lived. Silence was its own form of yearning. In Njal Saga, one man composes a verse for his beloved but never delivers it. He keeps it inside, and the reader is left to imagine, was there ever a kiss? Or was the poem the only place that intimacy could survive? One fascinating poetic technique the skalds used was embedding hidden meanings, double entendres, puns, wordplay. So a line that seemed to praise a noblewoman's wisdom might also describe the way her mouth curved in laughter. A verse about mead might really be about a stolen kiss behind a feast table. This gave poets plausible deniability. If someone accused them of getting too familiar, they could shrug and say, just poetry. Meanwhile, their muse was probably melting behind a woven curtain. And let's not ignore the oral tradition. These poems weren't written in journals, they were recited aloud, in halls, at weddings, in war camps. Imagine standing in front of 100 armed men, reciting a carefully metered verse about the way your lover's eyes haunt you. You can't come out and say you want to kiss her, so you say her glance was a spear, her voice a harp, her nearness the heat of battle. Everyone nods, but she knows what you meant. It wasn't just about hiding feelings, it was about surviving them. In a world where emotion could be dangerous, poetry let you kiss without touching, confess without consequences. It was a kind of magic, safer than spell work, more lasting than runes. And in some ways, those poetic kisses feel more powerful than the real thing. They linger. You don't have to describe the lips, the angle, the moment. You just need to hint. A single line, a metaphor sharp enough to slice through centuries. So now imagine this. A man sitting alone beside a fire, composing lines in his head. He'll never say them aloud. They're too soft, too real. He closes his eyes and imagines her mouth, not the feel of it, but the memory of it. A kiss never given, but perfectly imagined. Then he speaks a single line into the flame. It disappears in the smoke, but the kiss stays. Let's take a breath now, but don't relax too much. We're stepping into the realm of dreams, not the sweet, cozy kind where you fly or forget to wear pants to school. No, we're talking about Viking dreams. Ominous, cryptic, steeped in fate, and sometimes sealed with a kiss that never quite makes sense. In Norse culture, dreams weren't private psychological nonsense. They were prophecies, messages, warnings from the gods, and in those dreams, kisses took on strange new meanings, sometimes sweet, sometimes terrifying, always significant. In a society where every cough, cloud, and crossed bird could be read as a sign, dreams were taken seriously. You didn't just wake up, shrug, and go about your day. If you dreamed of a mouth on yours, especially if that mouth belonged to someone dead, divine, or unfamiliar, you were in for a rough week, or a shift in destiny, or a violent, fate-cracking detour from everything you thought you understood. Take the Saga of the Inglings, for example, which includes the story of King Vanlandi. He ignores a sorceress he was supposed to marry, so she sends a dream to punish him. In it, a figure straddles his chest. He feels that something brush his face. A mouth like smoke, the saga says, and then he suffocates in his sleep. Not exactly a romantic kiss, but definitely memorable. The image of lips descending through a dream, stealing your breath, appears again and again in Norse folklore. Sometimes it's a ghost, sometimes it's a cursed lover. Either way, the result is the same. You wake changed, if you wake at all. But not all the dream kisses are deadly. Some are weirdly tender. There's a folktale from Iceland, less saga, more fireside whisper, about a woman who dreams she's kissed by a stranger with cold lips and golden eyes. When she wakes, there's a ring on her finger, and snow melting at her doorstep, even though it's midsummer. She never marries, says she's already bound. Whether it's a love story or a warning, depends on how much you trust the dead to keep promises. Dream kisses also appear in stories of second sight. Forspa, the Norse gift of prophecy. A person might receive a vision not through sight or voice, but through sensation. And what more intense, startling sensation than a kiss? One saga describes a man dreaming of being kissed by a woman made of flame. He wakes with a scar on his cheek and an urgent sense that his family is in danger. He leaves his village. 3 days later, it burns. Coincidence? Probably not. In many of these stories, the kiss serves as a messenger, a sign that you've been chosen, marked, or warned. It's not affection, it's activation. Something larger than you wants your attention, and instead of a booming voice from the heavens, you get a mouth pressed to yours in a dream so vivid it steals the air from your lungs. And then there are the legends where a kiss in a dream leads to obsession. A man dreams of a woman night after night, always the same, her long hair, her cool lips, the way she says his name like she's forgotten it. He becomes consumed, starts skipping feasts, muttering verses under his breath. He goes to a Volva, a seeress, and begs for meaning. She tells him the truth. He's been kissed by a Draugr, a restless spirit. The only way to break the connection is to find her grave and place a charm stone on her lips. He does. The dreams stop, but so does his voice, forever. This idea of dream kisses as curses or binding shows up in multiple oral traditions across Scandinavia. Some involve enchanted objects, a kiss delivered through a mirror, through smoke, through a drop of blood on a rune. Others are more abstract, the idea that kissing someone in a dream without knowing them means your fate has changed course. You've opened a door you can't close. And it wasn't just individuals who took these dreams seriously. Communities listened. If someone dreamed of a kiss and then fell ill or acted strangely, neighbours might consult a seer, offer sacrifices, burn herbs. Because who you kissed in your dream might be less important than what they represented. Betrayal, temptation, divine interference. Of course, sometimes dream kisses were just dream kisses, longing given form. There are quiet verses, attributed to nameless lovers, where someone dreams of a kiss they never dared ask for in waking life. A widow dreams her husband returns, kisses her forehead and says, "It's time to let me go." A young man dreams of the girl he saw once at a feast. They kiss, then part, he wakes up, writes a poem, never sees her again. There's a fringe belief from later Icelandic sources that if you kissed someone in a dream and then met them in life, it meant you'd known each other in a past life. That the dream was memory, a lost thread tugging you back towards someone you hadn't yet met. It's romantic in that fuzzy metaphysical way, but it also speaks to how the Vikings saw fate, not as a line, but a loop. A kiss in a dream might not be random, it might be the gods nudging two souls to collide again, but let's not pretend the dream realm was a safe space. Plenty of Norse dreams were nightmares. Lips could belong to beasts, corpses, spirits half-formed. One saga tells of a man who dreams he's kissed by a wolf. When he wakes, his tongue is black. He loses the ability to speak clearly. People start avoiding him. Months later, he attacks his brother during a full moon. Was he cursed? Possessed? Mad? The kiss, once again, was the turning point. And yet, in all this strangeness, the same pattern repeats. A kiss in a dream isn't just affection. It's an encounter, a moment of contact across realms, between the known and the unknown, between what you want and what fate decides you're ready for. So now, let your thoughts float a little. Let the room slip sideways. You're in a quiet forest, or maybe a longhouse, or maybe nowhere at all. You lie still, eyes closed, but you feel something, warmth, breath. A mouth brushing yours, impossibly soft. No voice, just the kiss. You wake, nothing has changed, except everything. You've been kissed by a dream, your fate realigned, your soul ever so slightly off its hinges, and now, in the slow drift back to the waking world, we take a strange little sidestep into the most unexpected category of Viking kisses, the joke kiss. Yes, they existed. Yes, they were weird. And yes, they tell us something deeply revealing about how the Norse handled awkward affection, power plays, and the fine art of public humiliation. Because sometimes a kiss wasn't about desire or ceremony. Sometimes it was about the most Viking of things, mockery. Let's rewind to a feast. Imagine a long wooden hall flickering with firelight, benches full of warriors, the air thick with mead vapour and smoke from 100 wool cloaks. Everyone's halfway drunk. The skald is reciting heroic verse. Someone's trying to wrestle a bear rug. And then, as the tension bubbles and pride sharpens, it happens. One man, grinning with the unmistakable confidence of a guy who's had 7 too many hornfuls of ale, leans across the table and kisses another. Not affectionately, not flirtatiously, but mockingly. Right on the lips. Now in our world, that might just be seen as a weird party moment. In the Viking world, it could spark a blood feud. Because to kiss someone without permission, especially another man, wasn't just strange. It could be an insult, a suggestion that the person being kissed was lesser, submissive, ridiculous. It turned affection into ammunition. And Norse men, not exactly known for letting slights go unpunished. This practice wasn't common, but it pops up just often enough in the sagas and oral traditions to raise eyebrows. In Lokasenna, Loki, the god of chaos and unfiltered commentary, accuses several gods and goddesses of shameful behaviour. He doesn't actually kiss anyone, but he uses words like arrows. If you imagine him punctuating his jabs with a theatrical kiss, the scene makes perfect sense. Loki would be exactly the type to plant one on Thor just to watch him go red with rage. There are even hints that in some court rituals, mock kissing was used as part of public shame. For example, a chieftain might punish a man who had broken a minor oath, not by killing him, but by kissing him in front of the assembly. It sounds absurd until you realise that in Norse culture, masculinity was everything. To be seen as weak, effeminate or submissive, even momentarily, could destroy your reputation. A kiss performed like a joke could say, "You're beneath me," without ever drawing a sword. Of course, this wasn't limited to men. Women too could wield the joke kiss. A bold woman at a feast might kiss a man as a way to mock his indecision, his shyness, his failure to act like a real man. There's a tale, half legend, half farce, from the Orkneys about a chieftain's daughter who interrupts a duel by walking up to one of the fighters and kissing him square on the mouth. Now that you've been kissed like a housewife bitch, she says, maybe you'll fight like one. That's not affection, that's tactical humiliation. And then there's the nidstong, the insult pole. Not a kiss, but a cursed wooden staff carved with runes, erected as a public insult. Sometimes it featured a horse's head, sometimes carved faces with exaggerated lips. In a few strange versions of the story, the pole would be kissed by the one erecting it, sealing the curse. Again, it's not a kiss of love, it's weaponized ridicule. A kiss as punctuation to an insult. I hate you so much I'm going to kiss your symbolic representation in front of everyone. These performances didn't exist in a vacuum. They relied on the tension between public image and private behaviour. A kiss, in most contexts, was meant to be personal, hidden, sacred. By dragging it out into the open and twisting its meaning, Vikings could use it to mock, belittle, or challenge each other in front of an audience. It was social jujitsu, flipping affection into shame. But even these joke kisses weren't always malicious. Sometimes they were weirdly affectionate. In some humorous folk tales, a clumsy suitor might try to win over a woman with the kiss of a fool, a kiss that lands on her forehead, her ear, or in one legendary case, her shoulder because he tripped on a dog. She laughs, everyone laughs. He's humiliated, but also remembered. The kiss becomes his signature move, and by the end of the tale, she marries him anyway. Because sometimes the fool's kiss says more than a hero's silence. There's even a fringe folk belief from Western Norway that if a person you disliked kissed you during Yule, the Norse winter festival, it meant you would laugh together before next snowfall. So people would dare each other to kiss the most humorless man in the village, hoping to see him crack. Imagine a rowdy feast, a drunken aunt pushing two enemies together for a fate kiss, cackling as they both recoil. That's Viking sitcom energy right there. And of course there's the kind of kiss that isn't really a kiss at all. The almost kiss, a lean in, a whisper that comes a little too close. It's used in the sagas not as affection, but as bait. You thought this was romantic, the narrative seems to say. Gotcha. Now you're being mocked for even hoping. It's petty, it's cruel, it's also extremely human. So what does all this tell us about Viking culture? That affection wasn't always sacred, that intimacy could be twisted, that a kiss, stripped of its romance, could still shake a room. And most of all, that humour, dark, sharp-edged, performative, was one of the Vikings' most underestimated tools. They didn't just conquer with swords, they conquered with words, glances, gestures, and yes, the occasional kiss that wasn't meant to be kind. So as the firelight in your room flickers low and the blanket presses warm against your skin, picture it, a crowded feast hall roaring with laughter. A man stands, lifts his horn, walks across the room to his rival, and instead of striking him, he leans in, smirking, and plants a kiss right on his beard. Everyone gasps, and then someone laughs, and then everyone laughs, and the war? Postponed. For now. All right, dreamers, we've wandered through sacred kisses, cursed ones, battle-born and bard-whispered ones, but now let's slip into the quietest version of all, the kiss of parting. No sagas, no spells, no shouts from a feasting hall. Just two people standing close before everything changes. A ship is waiting. A sword must be drawn, a fate must be followed. And there, right before the tide pulls one of you away, is a kiss that might not even touch skin but leaves a mark just the same. In the Viking world, where life was full of departures and returns were never guaranteed, this was the most tender and the most devastating kiss of all. Start with the basic truth. Vikings were always leaving, whether for trade, war, raiding, exile or exploration. The rhythm of Norse life beat with the sound of boots on the long path and sails catching wind. Goodbyes weren't rare, they were routine, and with every farewell came a question that no one dared to ask aloud. Will I see you again? And sometimes, if you were lucky, or very, very brave, you kissed them, just once, quietly, and then you turned your back and didn't look again. Now, Norse culture wasn't big on public emotion. You didn't weep on someone's tunic or sob on the docks. But that doesn't mean those partings weren't heavy. In fact, the less said, the more weight it seemed to carry. There's a moment in Gisli's saga where Gisli knows he's about to be betrayed, about to die, and he quietly embraces his wife before slipping out in the early morning fog. No kiss is described, but come on, you feel it. That hush, that pause, is not a speech, it's an understanding. And if a kiss happened, it lived in the silence. Sometimes these goodbyes were between lovers. Sometimes they were between family. Fathers leaving sons behind to settle disputes. Sisters seeing their brothers off to war. Mothers placing a hand to their children's faces, too proud to cry. In a world ruled by fate, every farewell could be final. That made the smallest gestures, like a kiss to the forehead or a hand to the cheek, feel monumental. You weren't just saying goodbye, you were placing memory into their bones. There's a fragment in the saga of the people of Laxardalur, where a woman says farewell to her husband, who's travelling abroad. She tells him to bring back silks and spices, not because she wants them, but because she wants him to return. As he boards the ship, she presses her mouth to her scarf, then ties it to his wrist. No direct kiss. But symbolically, it's all there. Her lips, his skin, a thread of hope stretched tight across the sea. There's even a fringe belief recorded in late medieval Scandinavian folklore that a kiss placed on the forehead just before a journey was a kind of protection charm. It would mark the traveller so that no enemy blade could find their heart. Some mothers believed if they kissed the back of their child's head as they left, that child would always find their way home, no matter how long the road. That kind of faith lives in gesture, not words.